Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we explore the complete story of Sally Whitemane, the High Inquisitor of the Scarlet Crusade. Her tale is one of tragedy and fanaticism, of a child who lost everything to the plague of undeath and became one of the most feared zealots in all of Lordaeron. It is a story of how trauma shapes us, of how good intentions can curdle into cruelty, and of how even the most broken souls can find a path toward redemption. Sally Whitemane's journey takes us through some of the darkest chapters in the history of Azeroth. We will witness the fall of a kingdom, the rise of a crusade that lost its way, and the transformation of a young priestess into something terrible. But we will also see how death itself can sometimes offer what life denies: the clarity to see our mistakes and the opportunity to do better. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow the story to carry you. Tonight we tell the tale of Sally Whitemane, from the innocent child she once was to the death knight she has become. In the days before the fall, before the plague swept across the land and turned the living into shambling corpses, the kingdom of Lordaeron stood as humanity's greatest achievement. Its cities gleamed with white stone and golden spires. Its fields stretched endlessly across fertile valleys, and its people lived in relative peace under the protection of the Alliance. At the heart of this civilization burned the light, that holy power that blessed the kingdom's paladins and priests, that offered hope and healing to all who believed. The Church of the Holy Light was more than a religious institution in those days. It was the moral foundation upon which Lordaeron had been built, a beacon of righteousness that guided kings and commoners alike. The priests who served the light were healers and teachers, counselors and protectors. They tended to the sick, comforted the grieving, and stood as living examples of what humanity could achieve when it devoted itself to something greater than individual ambition. Among the most revered of the Church's institutions was the Monastery, a grand complex of buildings nestled in the rolling hills of what would one day be called Tirisful Glades. The monastery served as a center for learning and enlightenment, a place where young men and women came to study the ways of the light, to master the healing arts, and to prepare themselves for lives of service. Its halls echoed with hymns and prayers, its libraries contained volumes of sacred texts, and its gardens provided peaceful spaces for meditation and contemplation. The priests and priestesses who trained at the monastery went on to serve throughout Lordaeron and beyond. They became advisors to nobles, healers in hospitals, teachers in schools, and chaplains who accompanied armies into battle. The monastery's reputation for producing exceptional clergy made it one of the most prestigious institutions in the kingdom, and families considered it a great honor when their children were accepted for training there. But the monastery was not the only pillar of Lordaeron's strength. The Knights of the Silver Hand, that legendary order of paladins founded by Archbishop Alonsus Fowl and Uther the Lightbringer, represented the martial arm of the light's power. These holy warriors combined the healing arts of priests with the combat prowess of knights, creating champions who could both smite the enemies of justice and restore the wounded to health. They had proven themselves during the Second War against the Orcish horde, and they had earned the love and respect of the kingdom's people. The families of the Silver Hands paladins formed a community of their own, bound together by shared faith and common purpose. The children of these families grew up knowing that their fathers and mothers that served a higher calling, that they protected the innocent and battled the forces of darkness wherever they arose. These children played together, learned together, and dreamed together of the day when they might follow in their parents' footsteps. The town of Southshore, located along the southern coast of Lordaeron in the region known as Hillsbrad Foothills, was one such community. Nestled between green hills and the sparkling waters of the coast, Southshore was a prosperous fishing and trading town that had grown wealthy from its position along major shipping routes. Its streets were clean and well maintained, its houses were sturdy and comfortable, and its people were generally happy with their lot in life. Many families connected to the Silver Hand made their homes in or near Southshore, drawn by its pleasant climate and its relative distance from the political intrigues of the capital. Children from these families attended the same schools, played in the same streets, and formed friendships that would shape the course of history. Among these children was a young girl with bright eyes and an even brighter spirit, a girl who would one day become one of the most feared figures in all of Lordaeron. Her name was Sally Whitemane. Sally was born into a world of relative peace and prosperity, the daughter of a family with connections to the Church of the Holy Light. Little is known of her parents' specific occupations or their standing in society, but it is clear that they were part of the broader community of faithful who supported and sustained the Light's institutions. Sally grew up surrounded by the teachings of the Church, learning from an early age about the power of faith, the importance of service, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The town of Southshore provided an idyllic setting for a childhood. The streets were safe for children to play in. The surrounding countryside offered endless opportunities for adventure, and the community was close-knit enough that everyone knew everyone else. Sally made friends easily, her natural confidence and intelligence drawing other children to her. She was the kind of girl who organized games and led expeditions, who made up rules and ensured they were followed. Among her closest friends were two boys who would play crucial roles in the story to come. The first was Renault Mograine, the son of Alexandros Mograine, one of the most celebrated paladins in the Silver Hand. Renault was a serious boy, always conscious of the enormous expectations placed upon him as the heir to his father's legacy. He trained hard, studied diligently, and dreamed of the day when he would earn his own place among the knights who protected Lordaeron. The second friend was a boy called Little Jimmy, whose full name and ultimate fate have been lost to history. Jimmy was perhaps the most innocent of the three, a boy who simply enjoyed playing with his friends without worrying too much about the future. He was the kind of child who laughed easily and cried easily, who took joy in simple pleasures and never suspected that darkness was coming. Together, the three children played games that reflected the world they lived in and the values they had been taught. They would pretend to be holy warriors, vanquishing imaginary monsters and purifying imaginary corruption. Sally often took the lead in these games, directing her companions with an authority that seemed natural to her even at a young age. She would decree which of them would play the hero and which the villain, would design elaborate scenarios involving sieges and battles, and would always ensure that the forces of good triumphed in the end. In one typical scene from their childhood, preserved in the memories of those who witnessed it, Renault would pledge himself to Sally's service with mock solemnity, declaring that he stood at her side ready to face any foe. Sally would accept his oath with equal gravity, announcing that they would attack as one, that together they would defeat the forces of darkness. And when the imaginary battle was won, she would proclaim their victory with childish joy, never suspecting that such proclamations would one day carry very real and very terrible weight. These games were more than simple play. They were rehearsals for the lives that Sally and her friends expected to lead, preparations for the roles they assumed they would one day fill. Sally was clearly destined for a position of authority within the church. Her natural leadership abilities and her devotion to the light, marking her as someone who would rise through the ranks. Renault seemed equally destined for the Silver Hand, following in his father's footsteps as a champion of justice. Even little Jimmy might have found his place in the great machinery of Lordaeron's faithful institutions. But the future these children imagined was not the future they would receive. The darkness they pretended to fight in their games was real, and it was coming for them. The innocence of their childhood would be shattered by horrors beyond anything their young minds could conceive, and the games of purification they played would become terrible reality, twisted by trauma into something monstrous. As Sally grew older, she began to show real aptitude for the priestly arts. She could feel the light when she reached for it, could sense its warmth and power flowing through her when she prayed. Her teachers recognized her potential and encouraged her development, providing instruction in both the spiritual and practical aspects of serving the light. By the time she entered adolescence, it was clear that Sally Whitemane would become a priestess of considerable ability. Her friendship with Renault deepened as they grew, though it took on a different character than it had in childhood. They were no longer simply playmates, but fellow travelers on a shared path, young people preparing to dedicate their lives to the same cause. They understood each other in ways that others could not, sharing the burden of expectation and the privilege of faith. Whether there was ever anything romantic between them is unknown, but there was certainly a bond of mutual respect and loyalty. The world outside Southshore continued to turn during these years, and the children who played at being heroes gradually became aware of the real conflicts that shaped their kingdom. They heard stories of the Second War, of the orcish horde that had poured through the dark portal and laid waste to so much of the southern kingdoms. They learned about the heroes who had defeated that threat, about the paladins and warriors who had driven the orcs back and saved Lordaeron from destruction. These stories reinforced the values that Sally and her friends had absorbed from childhood. Good triumphed over evil. The light prevailed against darkness. Heroes rose to meet every challenge, and the faithful were always rewarded for their devotion. The world made sense to them because it followed rules they understood, because it operated according to principles they had been taught since birth. They could not have known that those principles were about to be tested as never before. They could not have imagined that the enemy coming for them would not be orcs or demons, but something far worse. They could not have prepared themselves for the day when the dead would rise to devour the living, when everything they knew and loved would be swept away by a tide of corruption and despair. That day was coming, and it would change Sally Whitemane forever. The seasons turned in Lordaeron as they always had, spring giving way to summer and summer to autumn in their eternal cycle. The farmers tended their fields, the merchants plied their trades, and the children of Southshore continued their games under skies that seemed perpetually blue. Sally Whitemane moved through these years with the certainty of youth, never doubting that tomorrow would be much like today, never questioning the stability of this world she inhabited. Her training in the priestly arts progressed steadily during this period. She learned the prayers of healing, the words that called the light's warmth into wounded flesh and mended bones that had been broken. She learned the prayers of protection, the invocations that wrapped the faithful in shields of golden radiance. And she learned, though her teachers did not emphasize this, the prayers of judgment, the commands that turned the light's pure energy into weapons against the unworthy. The instructors who taught Sally recognized her exceptional potential, but some worried about the intensity they saw in her. Most young priests approached their calling with a desire to help others, a gentle compassion that motivated their studies. Sally possessed that compassion, but alongside it burned something fiercer, a need to prove herself, a determination to become powerful enough that nothing could threaten those she loved. Her teachers hoped that maturity would temper this intensity. They could not know that events would instead amplify it beyond all measure. Renault Mograine continued his own training during these years, preparing to follow his father into the Silver Hand. The demands placed upon him were grueling, as befitting the son of Alexandros Mograine. He had to master swordsmanship and horsemanship, tactics and strategy, theology and history. He had to learn to channel the light not merely for healing, but for smiting, to combine the roles of priest and warrior into the unified discipline of the paladin. The friendship between Sally and Renault evolved as they grew. They were no longer children playing at heroism, but young adults preparing for lives of service. They spoke of the future, of the positions they hoped to hold, of the good they intended to do for the kingdom they loved. Sally confided her dreams of becoming a senior priestess, perhaps even rising to lead a temple of her own. Renault spoke of earning his place among the Silver Hand, of proving himself worthy of his father's name. Little Jimmy, their third companion, began to fade from their circle during this period. His path was diverging from theirs, leading toward a simpler life that did not involve the burdens of religious service or martial duty. He remained their friend, but the easy camaraderie of childhood was giving way to the more complicated relationships of approaching adulthood. None of them could have predicted the terrible reunion that awaited them in the Scarlet Monastery. The town of Southshore itself was changing as the years passed. Tensions between the Alliance and the Horde had not entirely subsided since the Second War, and the southern coast of Lordaeron saw occasional skirmishes with the orcs who had not been interned. These conflicts were minor compared to the great war that had preceded them, but they served as reminders that peace was fragile, that the threats to the kingdom had not been entirely eliminated. The adults of Southshore discussed these matters in worried tones, debating whether the internment camps were sufficient to contain the orcish threat, whether the Alliance should have been more thorough in its victory. Sally listened to these discussions with the partial attention of youth, absorbing the concerns without fully understanding their implications. She would learn soon enough that the orcs were the least of the threats facing her world. Religious life in Southshore revolved around the small chapel that served the town's faithful. Sally attended services there regularly, kneeling alongside her neighbors as the local priest led them in prayers of thanksgiving and petition. The rituals were comforting in their familiarity, the words of the liturgy providing a sense of connection to something larger than herself. She did not yet understand how important that connection would become, how desperately she would cling to it when everything else was stripped away. The festivals of the light marked the passage of the year, occasions for the community to gather in celebration. Sally participated enthusiastically in these events, her natural energy finding an outlet in the dancing and singing that accompanied them. She was popular among her peers, admired for her abilities, and respected for her devotion. If she sometimes seemed too intense, too driven, most attributed it to the ambition that would surely carry her to great heights within the church. The calm of these years was not absolute. There were deaths, as there were in any community, and Sally began to participate in the funerary rites that attended them. She learned the prayers that commended souls to the light's eternal embrace, the words that were supposed to comfort the bereaved and ease the passage of the departed. She spoke these prayers with conviction, believing wholly in the promises they contained. Death was not an ending, but a transition, the faithful taught, a journey to a better place where suffering could not follow. She would come to question those beliefs. She would come to wonder what kind of eternal embrace awaited those whose bodies rose from the grave to devour the living. But those questions lay in the future, along with the horrors that would prompt them. As Sally entered her late adolescence, she was sent to the monastery for more advanced training. The great complex in Tirisfal Glades represented the pinnacle of religious education in Lordaeron, and acceptance there was a significant achievement. Sally departed Southshore with her family's blessings and her own high hopes, not knowing that she would never return to the town of her childhood in any way that mattered. The monastery impressed her from her first glimpse of its walls. The buildings seemed to glow with an inner light, their white stone drinking in the sun and reflecting it back with intensified purity. The gardens were immaculate, the libraries vast, the instructors distinguished beyond anything she had encountered in Southshore. Sally threw herself into her studies with characteristic intensity, determined to make the most of the opportunity she had been given. She excelled in her classes, mastering techniques that other students struggled with for months. Her instructors noted her progress with approval, marking her as one of the most promising young priests to enter the monastery in years. She made new friends among her fellow students, though none who replaced Renault in her affections. She wrote letters home, describing her experiences and her achievements, receiving responses filled with parental pride. The years at the monastery were perhaps the happiest of Sally Whitemane's life. She was doing what she loved, surrounded by people who shared her devotion, preparing for a future that seemed bright with possibility. The darkness that would consume that future was still gathering in the north, still taking shape in the schemes of the cult of the damned and the machinations of the Lich King. But Sally knew nothing of these threats, and her ignorance allowed her a peace that knowledge would have destroyed. It could not last. Nothing could have prevented what was coming. The scourge had been designed by minds far vaster than mortal understanding, had been prepared over years of patient planning, had been engineered to destroy Lordaeron as completely as fire destroys parchment. Sally Whitemane's happiness, like the happiness of everyone who lived in the kingdom, was borrowed time that would soon be called due. The signs of approaching doom appeared gradually, like clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Travelers brought stories from the north, tales of strange sicknesses and mysterious deaths that the healers could not explain. At first, these reports seemed like the usual rumors that circulated through any kingdom, exaggerated accounts of ordinary misfortune blown out of proportion by fearful minds. But the stories kept coming, and they kept getting worse. The priests of the light were among the first to sense that something was truly wrong. Their healing prayers, which had always been effective against ordinary diseases, seemed to falter when confronting this new affliction. Those who tried to cure the afflicted often found themselves feeling drained, as if the sickness itself was somehow feeding on the holy power they channeled. Some healers who worked too closely with the infected began to show symptoms themselves, despite the protections that should have made them immune. For Sally and her friends in Southshore, these reports remained distant concerns for longer than they should have. The town's position in the southern reaches of Lordaeron meant that the plague had not yet reached them, and the optimism of youth made it easy to believe that the crisis would be resolved before it affected them personally. The adults talked in worried whispers, and the Silver Hand paladins were called away to investigate the situation, but life in Southshore continued much as it always had. Renault's father, Alexandros Mograine, was among those called to deal with the growing threat. The great paladin departed with his legendary blade, promising to return once the situation was under control. Renault watched his father ride away with a mixture of pride and anxiety, knowing that his family's honor demanded such sacrifices, but wishing nonetheless that his father could stay. It would be the last time he saw Alexandros as the man he had known. Sally continued her training in the priestly arts, her abilities growing stronger with each passing month. Her teachers noted her exceptional talent for channeling the light, particularly in its healing and protective aspects. She had a natural gift for sensing the injuries and ailments of those around her, and her prayers could mend wounds that would have killed a lesser patient. Some suggested that she might one day become one of the greatest healers in the kingdom's history. But Sally's gifts extended beyond mere healing. She discovered that the light could also be wielded as a weapon, that the same power which restored life could be turned to destroying the unworthy. This aggressive application of holy magic was not unusual among priests who served in military capacities, but Sally's aptitude for it was remarkable. When she called upon the light to smite practice targets, the resulting display of power left her teachers both impressed and slightly concerned. The duality of Sally's abilities, the capacity for both healing and harm, reflected something in her personality that even she did not fully understand. She genuinely wanted to help people, to ease suffering and protect the innocent. But she also possessed a fierce determination to punish those who caused suffering, a righteous anger that demanded vengeance as well as justice. These two impulses coexisted within her, sometimes harmoniously, and sometimes in tension, shaping the priestess she was becoming. As the months passed, the situations in the north deteriorated beyond anyone's worst fears. The plague was no longer a distant rumor, but a spreading catastrophe that was consuming entire towns. The dead were not staying dead, risen from their graves to attack the living with mindless hunger. The scourge, as this army of undead was called, grew stronger with each passing day, its numbers swelling as every victim it claimed became another soldier in its ranks. Prince Arthas Menethil, the crown prince of Lordaeron and a paladin of the Silver Hand, led the investigation into the plague's origins. His reports sent back to the capital painted an increasingly dire picture of the situation. This was no natural epidemic, but a deliberate attack on the kingdom, orchestrated by forces that sought nothing less than the complete destruction of human civilization. The Cult of the Damned, a secret organization of traitors and necromancers, had been distributing plagued grain throughout the northern provinces. The revelation that the plague was intentional changed everything. This was not a disaster to be endured, but a war to be fought. The Silver Hand mobilized in full force, its paladins riding north to confront the threat that endangered everything they had sworn to protect. Sally watched more and more of the knights she had grown up admiring depart for the front lines, knowing that many of them would not return. The Third War began not with invasion from beyond, but with corruption from within. A mysterious plague swept through the northern regions of Lordaeron, spreading from village to village with terrifying speed. At first, it seemed like an ordinary epidemic, tragic but manageable. The kingdom's healers were dispatched to tend to the sick, and the authorities took measures to contain the outbreak. No one understood, not yet, what they were truly dealing with. Prince Arthas Menethil, the beloved heir to Lordaeron's throne and a paladin of the Silver Hand, was among those sent to investigate the plague. Accompanied by his mentor Uther the Lightbringer and the sorceress Jaina Proudmoore, Arthas traveled to the affected regions to assess the situation and render whatever aid he could. What he found there shook him to his core. The plague was not merely killing people, it was raising them from the dead, transforming the victims into mindless undead creatures that served a dark intelligence beyond mortal understanding. The dead attacked the living, spreading the infection with every bite and scratch, creating an ever-growing army of shambling corpses. Towns that had been healthy just days before were now graveyards filled with walking nightmares. As Arthas investigated deeper, he discovered the terrible truth behind the plague. It had been deliberately created and spread by a cult calling itself the Cult of the Damned, servants of a mysterious entity known as the Lich King. The plagued grain that had caused so many deaths had been distributed intentionally, part of a vast conspiracy to weaken Lordaeron and prepare it for conquest. The undead army, which came to be called the Scourge, was not a natural disaster, but a weapon wielded by an enemy of unimaginable evil. The town of Hearthglen became one of the first major battlegrounds of this new war. Arthas arrived there hoping to rest his forces and gather supplies, only to discover that the plague had already reached the town's grain stores. Before his eyes, the people of Hearthglen began to transform, their bodies dying and rising again as servants of the Scourge. Arthas found himself fighting for his life against an enemy that had been innocent civilians just moments before. The battle that followed was desperate and horrific. Arthas's forces were vastly outnumbered by the rising tide of undead, and there seemed to be no end to them. Every villager who fell rose again as another enemy, swelling the Scourge's ranks while depleting the defenders. Arthas held the line through sheer determination and the power of the light, but he knew that he could not last forever. He sent Jaina to find Uther and bring reinforcements, then prepared to make his final stand. The reinforcements arrived in the nick of time. Uther led a force of paladins and soldiers to Hearthglen's relief, breaking through the undead siege and rescuing Arthas from certain death. But the victory was hollow. The town had been ravaged, its population decimated, and the scale of the threat was now clear to all who witnessed it. This was no ordinary plague, no simple outbreak that could be contained with quarantine and medicine. This was war, and Lordaeron was losing. It was during or shortly after this battle that Sally Whitemane first appears in the historical record as a participant in the events of the Third War. The exact details are unclear, but she arrived at Hearthglen with reinforcements and helped to drive back the attacking Scourge. She was still young, not yet the fearsome figure she would become, but already she showed the courage and the power that would mark her future career. The light burned bright in her hands as she struck down the undead, and her voice rang with authority as she rallied those around her. For Sally, the battle at Hearthglen must have been a revelation. She had trained to serve the light, had prepared herself to heal the sick and comfort the grieving. But now she discovered that the light could also be a weapon, that its power could be turned against the enemies of the living with devastating effect. The undead fell before her prayers as surely as they fell before the swords of the paladins. She was not merely a healer, but a warrior, and the realization filled her with a fierce joy. But there was horror mixed with that joy. Sally saw things at Hearthglen that no young priestess should have seen, witnessed atrocities that would haunt her, dreams for years to come. She saw children rise from the dead to attack their own parents. She saw friends turn on friends, their bodies puppeted by whatever dark power animated the Scourge. She saw the complete breakdown of everything she had believed about the natural order of the world. The battle at Hearthglen was just the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, Sally witnessed the steady collapse of everything she had known. King Tyrannus was murdered by his own son, who had succumbed to darkness in his desperate attempt to save his people. Uther the Lightbringer, the greatest paladin who had ever lived, was cut down by the very prince he had trained and loved. The capital city of Lordaeron fell, its streets choked with the dead, its throne claimed by the monster that had once been its heir. The survivors of the Silver Hand scattered, each seeking their own path through the catastrophe. Some retreated south, hoping to find safety beyond the plague's reach. Others stood their ground, determined to fight for every inch of their homeland. And some began to organize, to gather the faithful together and forge a new force that could oppose the Scourge. Somewhere in the midst of this chaos, Sally Whitemane experienced the trauma that would define the rest of her existence. She and her family were traveling through northern Lordaeron, perhaps fleeing the advancing scourge, or perhaps on some other mission, when disaster struck. The plague found them, and one by one, Sally's family members succumbed to its corruption. What happened next is almost too horrible to contemplate. Sally watched as her parents, her siblings, everyone she loved in the world, died before her eyes. She watched as their bodies twitched and spasmed, as the light faded from their eyes, only to be replaced by a terrible hunger. She watched as they rose from death, no longer the family she had known, but mindless undead creatures driven by an insatiable need to kill. And then Sally did what she had to do. With the power of the light burning in her hands, she destroyed them. She struck down the shambling corpses that had been her mother and father, her brothers and sisters. She ended their twisted existence with prayers that were also screams, with holy fire that was also tears. She did what the light demanded, what survival required, what simple mercy dictated. But mercy brought no comfort, and survival brought no peace. When it was over, Sally Whitemane stood alone among the bodies of her family, covered in their blood and her own guilt. The girl who had played at purifying monsters in the streets of Southshore had now purified monsters for real, and she had discovered that the monsters wore the faces of everyone she loved. Something broke in Sally that day, something that would never heal. The trauma carved itself into her soul, leaving scars that would shape every choice she made from that moment forward. The guilt and the rage that filled her heart would never fade, never soften, never allow her a moment's peace. She had done what was necessary, what was right, what the light itself demanded. But necessity and rightness brought no comfort when she closed her eyes and saw her mother's dead face lunging at her throat. From that day forward, Sally Whitemane found meaning in only one thing: the destruction of the undead. Every shambling corpse she struck down was a blow against the force that had taken her family from her. Every scourge creature she destroyed was a small measure of revenge against the darkness that had ruined her life. The hatred that began to fester in her heart would grow and grow until it consumed everything else, until it became the defining characteristic of her existence. The transformation was not instantaneous, but gradual, a slow hardening of the soul that occurred one experience at a time. In the days immediately following her family's death, Sally wandered the plague-ravaged countryside in something like a fugue state. She did not eat, did not sleep, did not speak to the few survivors she encountered. She simply moved, putting distance between herself and the place where her world had ended, walking without destination or purpose. The light remained with her, even in this darkest of times. It answered when she called upon it, burning away the undead that stumbled into her path. She killed dozens of the creatures during her wandering, perhaps hundreds, her prayers of destruction becoming automatic, reflexive. She was not consciously choosing to fight. She was simply eliminating anything that reminded her of what had happened, purging the world of the corruption that had taken everything she loved. Other survivors of the plague found her eventually, a group of refugees fleeing toward the relative safety of the southern regions. They were frightened people, traumatized and desperate, but they recognized Sally's power and they welcomed her among them. Her abilities could protect them during their journey, could destroy the undead that blocked their path. They did not understand the depth of her damage, did not recognize the signs of a mind that had been pushed past its breaking point. Sally traveled with these refugees for several weeks, gradually recovering enough functionality to speak and interact with others. But she was not the same person she had been. The warmth that had once characterized her interactions was gone, replaced by a cold intensity that unsettled those around her. She did her duty, protected the group, healed their wounds when necessary, but she did so without compassion, without connection, as if performing the actions of a priestess while feeling nothing of what a priestess should feel. The nightmares began during this period and would never truly stop. Every night, Sally relived the moment when her family rose from death, when she was forced to destroy them with her own hands. She saw her mother's face contorted with hunger, saw her father's hands reaching for her throat, saw her siblings shambling toward her with dead eyes and rotting flesh. She woke screaming more nights than not, her prayers of protection blazing around her in response to threats that existed only in her memory. Sleep became something Sally feared rather than welcomed. She began to push herself to exhaustion, to stay awake as long as humanly possible before collapsing into the nightmares she could not escape. This pattern would persist throughout her life, contributing to the instability that would mark her tenure as High Inquisitor. The sleep-deprived mind is vulnerable to paranoia, to seeing threats where none exist, to believing the worst about everyone and everything. Her faith survived the trauma, but it was transformed into something the light's teachers would not have recognized. Sally no longer believed in a benevolent deity that protected the faithful and rewarded the righteous. She believed in a cosmic power that could be wielded against evil, a weapon that existed for the purpose of destruction. The healing aspects of her training fell away, de-emphasized in favor of the aggressive applications that served her need for vengeance. The prayers she had learned for comfort and restoration gathered dust in her memory, while the prayers of judgment and smiting became sharper, more powerful, more precise. Sally discovered that she could channel more of the light's destructive potential than she had ever managed before, that her trauma had somehow unlocked reserves of power that normal training could not access. The light responds to conviction, and Sally's conviction had become absolute. The undead must be destroyed utterly and without mercy. When the survivors Sally traveled with finally reached the southern provinces, she did not stay with them. She had no interest in safety, no desire for the quiet life they sought. She turned north again, back toward the Plague Lands, seeking more enemies to destroy. The others watched her go with a mixture of gratitude and relief. They were thankful for her protection during their journey, but they were also disturbed by what she had become. Whatever Sally Whitemane was now, she was no longer someone they wanted to be around. Alone once more, Sally became something between a crusader and a ghost. She haunted the edges of the Plague Lands, striking at scourge patrols and isolated undead, never staying in one place long enough to be found by the larger forces that would have overwhelmed her. She was learning the tactics of guerrilla warfare, the strategies of the lone combatant operating behind enemy lines. These skills would serve her well in the years to come. News of her activities began to spread among the scattered survivors of Lordaeron. Stories told of a mad priestess who walked alone through the Plague Lands, her prayers burning holes through the undead, her voice raised in hymns of destruction. Some called her a saint, a champion sent by the light to punish the forces of evil. Others called her a lunatic, a broken woman who would soon die in her futile war against an enemy that could not be defeated by a single warrior. Both assessments contained elements of truth. Sally Whitemane was indeed touched by a divine power that exceeded what most priests could channel, and she was indeed putting herself in danger that no rational person would accept. The line between heroism and insanity is often thinner than we would like to believe, and Sally had crossed it in both directions. The young priestess, who had once dreamed of healing the sick and comforting the grieving, was dead. In her place stood something harder, colder, more terrible. Sally Whitemane was becoming the High Inquisitor. The fall of Lordaeron did not happen all at once, though it often seems that way in the telling. The kingdom died by degrees, its strength bleeding away through countless battles and countless betrayals, its people scattered and slaughtered until only remnants remained. The survivors who would not flee and could not accept defeat gathered together in the months following the capital's fall, determined to fight for their homeland, even if they could not save it. The murder of Uther the Lightbringer left the Knights of the Silver Hand leaderless and demoralized. The order that had been the shield of Lordaeron was shattered, its members killed or scattered, its reputation stained by the actions of its most famous member. Some knights gave in to despair, abandoning their oaths and fleeing to whatever safety they could find. Others died in futile last stands against the endless tide of undead. But a core of the Silver Hand survived, and these survivors began to organize. In the town of Southshore, the very place where Sally Whitemane had spent her childhood, a secret meeting was convened. The participants included some of the most respected paladins and priests who remained in Lordaeron, men and women who refused to accept that their cause was lost. Grand Inquisitor Isillion was among them, a fierce priest whose hatred of the undead matched anything Sally Whitemane would later display. High General Abundus attended as well, a warrior whose skill and courage had saved countless lives during the initial outbreak. His daughter Brigitte came with him, already showing the same dedication to the cause that marked her father. Talon Fordring, son of the legendary Tyrion Fordring, was there, a young paladin eager to prove himself worthy of his family name. And then there was Alexandros Mograine, the wielder of the Ashbringer. Alexandros was perhaps the greatest champion Lordaeron had ever produced, a paladin whose power and righteousness were matched only by his devotion to his duty. During the Second War, he had fought with distinction against the Orcish horde, earning a reputation for fearlessness and skill that made him a legend among his peers. When the scourge arose, Alexandros had been at the forefront of the battle against them, cutting swaths through the undead with a blade that seemed to burn with holy fire. The weapon he carried was the Ashbringer, a sword forged from a corrupted artifact that Alexandros himself had purified. The dark crystal had been recovered from the orcs of Blackrock Spire, and its evil was so profound that it had resisted all attempts at cleansing. But Alexandros and his fellow paladins had gathered together and performed a ritual of such power that the corruption was not merely removed, but transformed. The resulting blade radiated with the light's glory, and the undead who faced it crumbled to ash before its touch, giving the weapon its name. With Alexandros and his Ashbringer at their head, the survivors of the Silver Hand formed a new organization dedicated to a single purpose: the complete destruction of the Scourge. They called themselves the Scarlet Crusade, the word scarlet chosen because their cause would be written in blood, both that of their enemies and their own. They swore to take back their homeland or die in the attempt, to never surrender and never retreat, to fight until the last undead creature was destroyed or until they themselves fell. The founding of the Scarlet Crusade represented hope in a time of absolute darkness. Here was a force that would stand against the Scourge, that would fight back against the tide of death that had swept away everything else. The refugees who had lost their homes, the soldiers who had seen their comrades slaughtered, the priests and paladins who had watched their world crumble, all of them looked to the Scarlet Crusade and saw a chance for redemption. The organization's name was chosen deliberately, a symbol of the blood that would be shed in the struggle to come. Red was the color of sacrifice, of martyrdom, of the vital force that separated the living from the dead. The Crusaders would wear that color proudly, marking themselves as warriors willing to pay any price for victory. They did not yet understand how terrible that price would become. The Crusade's founding members brought diverse skills and experiences to the new organization. Alexandros Mograine provided military leadership and the unmatched power of the Ashbringer. Grand Inquisitor Izilian brought theological authority and a zeal for rooting out corruption. High General Abendus contributed strategic expertise and the loyalty of soldiers who had served under him. Sidon Dathrohan offered political connections and administrative ability, though none could know that he had already been replaced by the Dreadlord Balnazar. Together, these leaders established the structures that would govern the Scarlet Crusade for years to come. They created ranks and hierarchies, assigned responsibilities and authorities, drafted the codes of conduct that would guide their followers. They established training protocols for new recruits, supply chains for their military operations, and communication networks to coordinate their scattered forces. The early recruits to the crusade came from all walks of life. Former soldiers of Lordaeron's army joined alongside civilian survivors, their different backgrounds united by shared loss and shared hatred. Priests and paladins who had seen their churches desecrated pledged themselves to the cause, bringing the light's power to augment the crusade's martial strength. Even some foreign volunteers arrived, fighters from other kingdoms who wanted to strike back against the scourge that threatened all of Azeroth. Training camps were established in the territories the crusade controlled, places where raw recruits could be transformed into disciplined warriors. The training was harsh by necessity, as the enemies they would face showed no mercy and required no rest. New crusaders learned to fight against opponents who felt no pain and knew no fear, who could only be stopped by destroying the dark magic that animated them. They learned to recognize the signs of plague infection, to identify potential threats before they could spread, to trust nothing and no one outside their own ranks. The religious component of the Crusade's training was equally rigorous. Every crusader, whether priest or warrior, was expected to maintain a devotional practice that kept them connected to the light. Daily prayers, regular confessions, and constant vigilance against spiritual corruption were required of all members. The leaders believed that faith was not merely a source of power, but a defense against the darkness, that those who wavered in their devotion would become vulnerable to the scourge's influence. This combination of military discipline and religious fervor created soldiers who were utterly dedicated to the Crusade's mission. They believed with absolute certainty that their cause was righteous, that the light itself had chosen them to cleanse Lordaeron of the undead taint. This belief sustained them through battles that would have broken ordinary warriors, kept them fighting when any rational assessment would have demanded retreat. But the same qualities that made the early Crusaders effective warriors also made them vulnerable to manipulation. Their faith could be directed against false targets. Their zeal could be twisted into hatred of the innocent. Their discipline could be used to enforce unjust commands. The seeds of the Crusade's corruption were planted in the very soil of its foundation. Sally Whitemane was among those who answered the Crusade's call. She and her childhood friend, James Vicious, joined together, likely through their connection to Renault Mograine, who had followed his father into the new organization. Sally was young, still bearing the fresh wounds of her family's loss, but her power with the light was already remarkable. The Crusade welcomed her abilities and her zeal, recognizing in her a kindred spirit who shared their absolute commitment to the destruction of the undead. The early days of the Scarlet Crusade were marked by genuine heroism. The Crusaders fought battle after battle against the scourge, pushing back the undead wherever they could and establishing strongholds throughout what remained of Lordaeron. The town of Hearthglen became one of their primary bases, its position in the western Plaguelands making it strategically vital. The Scarlet Monastery, that ancient center of religious learning, was converted into a fortress where the Crusade could train new recruits and coordinate their operations. Sally distinguished herself during this period, her power growing with each battle she survived. She discovered that her abilities extended beyond the usual healing and protective prayers of a priestess. She could channel the light offensively, burning the undead with holy fire and searing away the dark magic that animated them. More remarkably, she began to develop powers of resurrection that exceeded anything normal priests could achieve. The ability to raise the dead had always been the province of the light's most powerful servants. It required not merely skill, but faith of such intensity that it could challenge death itself. Sally possessed that faith, though her version of it was twisted by trauma into something darker than the pure devotion that traditionally powered such miracles. Her resurrection magic was fueled by her desperate need to undo death, to reverse the terrible losses she had suffered, to prove that the light was stronger than the darkness that had taken everything from her. Within the Crusade, Sally found structure and purpose. The organization provided a framework for her rage, channeling her hatred of the undead into something productive. She had comrades who shared her pain, mentors who guided her development, and enemies who deserved every bit of destruction she could bring upon them. The Crusade became her family, replacing the one she had lost, and she devoted herself to it with the same intensity she had once devoted to her actual family. Her friendship with Renault Mograine continued, though it had changed from the innocent bond of their childhood. They were now soldiers together, fighting in the same war, sharing the same trauma. Renault had his own burdens to bear, particularly the weight of his father's legend and his own desire to prove himself worthy of the Mograine name. Sally understood that burden because she carried her own version of it, the need to justify her survival by destroying as many of the enemy as possible. Together with James Vicious, who would eventually become the infamous interrogator in the Scarlet Monastery, and other survivors of their generation, Sally and Renault formed the core of the Crusade's younger members. They were the future of the organization, the ones who would carry on the fight after their elders had fallen. They trained together, fought together, and slowly began to change together as the crusade itself began to change. For something was wrong with the Scarlet Crusade, though few recognized it at first. The noble organization that had been founded to protect the innocent and destroy the undead was beginning to shift, its focus narrowing, its methods becoming harsher. Suspicion crept into its ranks, and accusations of plague infection became common. People who had been allies were suddenly treated as potential enemies, and the line between the Scourge and everyone else began to blur. The source of this corruption was hidden at the very top of the Crusade's leadership, wearing the face of one of its most respected founders. Saidan Dathrohan had been a paladin of impeccable reputation, a lord commander of the Silver Hand whose courage and dedication had never been questioned. He had been among the founding members of the Scarlet Crusade, lending his authority and experience to the new organization. When he spoke, others listened. When he commanded, others obeyed. His position within the Crusade was second only to Alexandros Mograine himself. But Saidan Dathrohan was dead. He had died during an assault on Stratholme, separated from his forces and overwhelmed by the undead. His body had fallen in the ruins of that cursed city, and something else had risen, wearing his face. Balnazar was a dreadlord, one of the Nathrazim demons, who had served the Burning Legion since time immemorial. He and his brothers had been instrumental in creating the Scourge, in corrupting Arthas Menethil, in orchestrating the fall of Lordaeron. When the Lich King had turned against his demonic masters, the Dreadlords had been forced to flee, their carefully laid plans disrupted by their own creation's rebellion. Balnazar should have been destroyed. The Dark Lady Sylvanas Windrunner, leading her Forsaken against the remaining demons in Lordaeron, had cornered him and forced his brother Varamathras to execute him as proof of loyalty. But the execution had been faked, and Balnazar had escaped to seek new opportunities for chaos and destruction. He found that opportunity in the corpse of Saidan Dathrohan. The Dreadlord possessed the dead paladin's body, animating it with his own dark power and using it to infiltrate the organization Dathrohan had helped create. It was a perfect disguise. No one would suspect that the Grand Crusader of the Scarlet Crusade was actually a demon, one of the very architects of the catastrophe the Crusade sought to avenge. From his position of authority, Balnazar began to corrupt the Scarlet Crusade from within. He encouraged the paranoia that had already begun to take root, fanning the flames of suspicion until they consumed all trust. He whispered suggestions that turned the Crusade's righteous anger against anyone who might oppose their methods, convincing them that everyone outside their ranks was a potential servant of the Scourge. The Dreadlord's goal was simple: to transform the Scarlet Crusade from a threat to the Scourge into a weapon against its enemies. by making the Crusaders so paranoid and violent that they attacked living humans as readily as undead. Balnazzar ensured that the forces of the light would tear each other apart. Every innocent person tortured and killed by the Scarlet Crusade was a victory for the very darkness they thought they were fighting. But Balnazzar's greatest coup was yet to come. Alexandros Mograine and his Ashbringer represented the single greatest threat to the Scourge in Lordaeron. As long as the High Lord lived, as long as that terrible blade cleaved through the undead, there was hope that the Scourge might eventually be defeated. Balnazzar needed to eliminate that threat, but he could not do so directly. He needed a tool, a weapon that could strike at Mograine from within. He found that weapon in Renault Mograine, Alexandros' own son. Renault had always struggled with his father's legend. Living in the shadow of the Ashbringer, constantly compared to a hero he could never hope to equal, Renault had developed a festering resentment that he barely acknowledged even to himself. He loved his father, admired him, wanted desperately to make him proud, but he also envied him, resented him, wished that he could somehow escape the endless comparison. Balnazzar, wearing the face of the trusted Dathrohan, saw this weakness and exploited it. He befriended Renault, offered him sympathy and understanding, suggested that perhaps Alexandros had never truly appreciated his eldest son. He played on Renault's jealousy of his younger brother Darion, who seemed to receive more of their father's affection. He whispered that Renault would never receive the recognition he deserved as long as his father lived, that the Ashbringer's shadow would always eclipse his own accomplishments. The manipulation was subtle and patient, taking place over months and years. Balnazzar did not simply convince Renault to kill his father. He corrupted Renault's entire worldview, twisted his perception until murder seemed not merely acceptable, but necessary. He made Renault believe that Alexandros was actually holding back the crusade, that his death would somehow benefit the cause they all served. The trap was finally sprung on a dark day that would live in infamy. Balnazzar, as Dathrohan, came to Renault with urgent news. His younger brother, Darion, had been captured by the Scourge and was being held near Stratholme. Alexandros must be told immediately, must be convinced to lead a rescue mission. Renault, eager to prove himself and perhaps save his brother, agreed to deliver the message, but there was no captured Darion. The entire story was a lie designed to lure Alexandros into an ambush. When the High Lord rode out to save his son, accompanied only by Renault and a few trusted companions, including his advisor, High Inquisitor Fairbanks, he was riding to his death. The ambush site was near the ruined city of Stratholme, where the Scourge remained strongest. Wave after wave of undead attacked the small party, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. Fairbanks fell early in the battle, buried beneath a pile of corpses, and left for dead. But Alexandros fought on, the Ashbringer blazing in his hands, turning every undead that came within reach to ash. For hours the High Lord battled alone, his strength sustained by his faith and his desperate hope that he might yet save his son. But even the greatest warrior cannot fight forever. Exhausted beyond measure, Alexandros finally faltered, and the Ashbringer slipped from his weakened grip. This was the moment Renault had been waiting for, the moment Balnazzar had prepared him for. Coming up behind his father, Renault picked up the fallen blade. Alexandros turned, relief flooding his face at the sight of his son. Perhaps Renault had come to help. Perhaps together they could still escape. Then Renault drove the Ashbringer through his father's heart. The moment of Alexandros' death was witnessed only by Renault and the undead who surrounded them. But if one could have observed from outside, one would have seen the transformation that overtook the Ashbringer in that instant. The blade that had burned with holy radiance, that had turned countless undead to ash, flickered and darkened as its wielder's lifeblood flowed down its length. Patricide is considered one of the most terrible crimes in every culture across Azeroth, and for good reason. The bond between parent and child is sacred, a connection that transcends mere biology to touch something fundamental in the nature of existence. When that bond is violated through murder, when a son kills the father who gave him life, the spiritual consequences are profound. The Ashbringer, forged from a crystal of pure light and consecrated with the faith of Lordaeron's greatest paladins, was particularly sensitive to such corruption. The blade had been created to embody everything that the light represented: hope, protection, the triumph of good over evil. When it was used to commit an act of ultimate betrayal, that embodiment was inverted. The light became darkness, the hope became despair, and the blade that had protected the innocent became a weapon of corruption. Alexandros Mograine's final expression, the look of confused betrayal as he recognized what his son had done, would haunt Renault for the rest of his life. Even as the young man convinced himself that the murder had been necessary, even as he crafted the lies that would protect him from discovery, he could not escape his father's eyes. They would appear in his dreams, would flash before him in moments of quiet, would judge him with a sorrow more terrible than any condemnation. The corrupted Ashbringer pulsed with dark energy as Alexandros fell. The undead who had been attacking the party ceased their assault, as if recognizing that something significant had changed. The blade's new nature called to them, resonated with the dark magic that animated their corpses. They bowed before Renault, acknowledging the new master of a weapon that had once been their doom. The blade that had been forged to destroy the undead now murdered its own wielder. Alexandros Mograine, the greatest champion of the light, died at the hands of his own son, betrayed by his own weapon. And with his death, something happened to the Ashbringer itself. The holy light that had burned within it was corrupted by the act of patricide, transformed into something dark and terrible. The blade that had been the scourge's greatest enemy became a weapon of evil. Renault stood over his father's body, the corrupted Ashbringer heavy in his hands. He should have felt triumph, should have felt the liberation that Balnazar had promised him. Instead, he felt only emptiness, a void where his soul had been that nothing would ever fill. He had done what the demon had convinced him was necessary, and it had cost him everything that made him human. But there was no time for reflection. The lie must be maintained. The truth must be buried. The crusade must never know what had really happened. Renault composed himself, forced his features into an expression of grief that was not entirely feigned, and prepared to return to the Scarlet Monastery with the story he had rehearsed in his mind 100 times. Renault fled with the corrupted Ashbringer, returning to the Scarlet Crusade with a tale of heroic battle and tragic loss. He claimed that his father had fallen fighting the Scourge, that there had been nothing anyone could do. The crusade mourned their fallen High Lord, never suspecting that his killer walked among them, wearing the rank and honors that murder had won. Fairbanks, the advisor who had survived by hiding beneath the corpses of the undead, eventually made his way back to the Scarlet Monastery. He tried to tell the truth about what had happened, tried to expose Renault's treachery, but no one would believe him. Accused of being corrupted by his contact with the undead, Fairbanks was executed for his trouble, silenced before he could reveal the secret that Balnazar so desperately wanted to protect. The death of Alexandros Mograine marked a turning point for the Scarlet Crusade. With their greatest hero gone and their leadership thoroughly corrupted, the organization descended further into fanaticism and madness. The paranoia that Balnazar had cultivated grew into full-blown insanity, and the crusade began to see enemies everywhere. Sally Whitemane, grieving for the High Lord who had been a symbol of hope, embraced the new direction with fervor. Her own trauma had left her with wounds that never healed, and the Crusade's increasingly harsh methods resonated with her own burning hatred. She rose through the ranks, her power and her zeal making her invaluable to the organization. She became an Inquisitor, then a High Inquisitor, ultimately taking command of the Scarlet Monastery itself. Meanwhile, some members of the Silver Hand recognized what was happening to the Crusade and refused to follow it into madness. Lord Maxwell Tyrosus led these dissidents away to form a new organization, the Argent Dawn, which would continue the fight against the Scourge without succumbing to the paranoia that infected their former comrades. The split weakened both groups, but it preserved at least one force dedicated to the light's true purpose. The Scarlet Crusade that remained was a twisted shadow of its founder's vision. Under the hidden guidance of Balnazar and the open leadership of fanatics like Sally Whitemane, it became a force of terror that threatened the living almost as much as it threatened the undead. The organization that had been created to protect the innocent now tortured and murdered them, seeing plague corruption in every stranger and treachery in every outsider. Sally Whitemane had found her calling, and it was written in blood. The Scarlet Monastery, under Sally Whitemane's command, became a fortress of fanaticism, a place where the light was wielded not to heal, but to harm, where prayer became interrogation and service became submission. The four wings of the complex, each once dedicated to different aspects of religious life, were transformed into instruments of the Crusade's twisted mission. The graveyard, where the monastery's dead had once rested in peace, became a battleground where the Crusade fought an endless war against the undead that rose from the earth. The library, that repository of sacred knowledge, was now used to train new recruits in the Crusade's ideology, filling their minds with paranoia and hatred. The armory housed the weapons and equipment of the Crusade's warriors, ready to be deployed against anyone deemed an enemy of the cause. And the cathedral, the heart of the monastery, served as the seat of Whitemane's power. Sally ruled the monastery with absolute authority, her word law to all who served within its walls. She was feared by her subordinates, not merely for her cruelty, but for her power, for the abilities that made her seem almost superhuman. The light answered her call with terrifying force, and her resurrection magic meant that death itself was no escape from her service. Those who fell fighting for the crusade could be raised again by her prayers, return to battle whether they wished it or not. Her partnership with Renault Mograine, now holding the rank of Scarlet Commander, gave her control over both the spiritual and martial aspects of the monastery's operations. Renault commanded the soldiers, leading them in battle against the Scourge and anyone else the Crusade deemed an enemy. Sally commanded the priests and inquisitors, overseeing the interrogations that extracted confessions from the accused and the rituals that sustained the Crusade's power. Together, they transformed the Scarlet Monastery into a machine of terror. Prisoners were brought to the dungeons beneath the complex, accused of plague corruption or Scourge sympathies on the flimsiest of pretexts. Interrogators like James Vicious, Sally's childhood friend who had followed her into madness, used torture to extract confessions from innocent people who had done nothing wrong. Those who confessed were executed as enemies of the light. Those who refused to confess were tortured until they broke. The methods employed by the Scarlet Crusade in their interrogations were horrific, designed to cause maximum suffering while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Vicious, who had earned the title of interrogator through his skill at inflicting pain, became notorious for his cruelty. He saw his work not as torture, but as purification, believing that the agony he caused was cleansing his victims' souls of corruption. Sally approved of his methods, perhaps even encouraged them, seeing no contradiction between the light she served and the suffering she sanctioned. Under Sally's leadership, the monastery became increasingly isolated from the outside world. The Crusade trusted no one who was not one of their own, saw plague corruption in every stranger, and treated contact with outsiders as potential contamination. Visitors were greeted with suspicion at best and violence at worst. Refugees seeking shelter from the Scourge were turned away, or worse, imprisoned on suspicion of being plague carriers. This isolation fed upon itself, creating an echo chamber where the most extreme views went unchallenged. Sally and her followers convinced themselves that they alone remained pure, that everyone outside their ranks had been corrupted by the Scourge's influence. Their paranoia was not merely emotional, but theological, a sincere belief that the plague had infected the entire world, and that only the Scarlet Crusade remained free of its taint. The tragedy was that Sally Whitemane believed she was doing the right thing. The trauma of her family's death had left her with wounds that never healed, and the hatred that filled those wounds was not mere malice, but genuine conviction. She truly believed that the methods she employed were necessary, that the suffering she caused was serving a greater purpose. The light still answered her prayers, still flowed through her when she called upon it, and she took that as confirmation that her path was righteous. But the light does not discriminate based on the intentions of its wielder. It is a force that responds to faith and willpower, not to moral virtue. Paladins who have fallen to corruption have continued to channel the light's power, and priests who have committed terrible sins have maintained their connection to it. Sally's ability to wield the light did not prove that her actions were justified. It only proved that her faith was strong. Within the monastery, Sally's daily routine revolved around the rituals of the Crusade. She led prayers each morning, calling upon the light to strengthen the faithful and destroy the enemies of the cause. She presided over trials of accused plague carriers, pronouncing judgment on men and women whose only crime was arousing someone's suspicion. She visited the training halls where new recruits were indoctrinated, ensuring that they absorbed the proper degree of zeal and paranoia, and she waited for the dead to rise. The resurrection power that made Sally infamous was not a gentle gift. When a crusader fell in battle, she could call their spirit back from death, forcing them to return to their bodies, whether they wished it or not. The process was painful for the one being raised, and traumatic for those who witnessed it. But Sally saw it as a mercy, a way to give the faithful another chance to serve the light. She could not understand why some of those she raised seemed less than grateful. Her most famous demonstration of this power came during encounters with adventurers who invaded the monastery. When the Scarlet Commander fell in battle, Sally would cast her most powerful spell, Deep Sleep, incapacitating all nearby enemies. Then, with a cry that echoed through the cathedral, she would call upon the light to raise her fallen champion. The words she spoke in that moment became legendary, known to every adventurer who faced her. "Arise, my champion." And the dead would rise, returning to battle at her command, proof of her power and her faith. It was a display that terrified those who witnessed it and reinforced the Crusade's belief in her divine mandate. If the light granted her the power to reverse death itself, how could she be anything other than righteous? But resurrection was not the only ability that made Sally formidable. She was a powerful healer, capable of restoring the wounded to full health with a word. She could shield herself and others with barriers of holy light, deflecting attacks that would have killed a lesser priest. And her offensive prayers could sear the flesh of the unbelieving, burning those who dared to challenge her authority. The combination of these abilities made Sally almost unkillable. Adventurers who came to the monastery seeking to eliminate the Crusade's leadership found themselves facing an enemy who could heal her wounds, protect herself from damage, and return from death itself. Many who challenged her fell in the attempt, their bodies left to rot in the cathedral they had tried to cleanse. Yet despite her power, despite her faith, despite her conviction that she served the light, Sally Whitemane was a deeply damaged person. The trauma of her family's death had never been processed, never been healed, never been allowed to scar over. She had taken that pain and turned it into hatred, had built her entire identity around the destruction of the undead, and in doing so, had become something almost as monstrous as the creatures she fought. Her cruelty was not sadism for its own sake, but a desperate attempt to fill the void inside her. Every undead she destroyed, every suspected plague carrier she condemned, every act of violence she sanctioned was an offering to the memory of her family. She was trying to make their deaths mean something by dedicating her life to ensuring that no one else suffered as she had suffered. But the methods she chose only created more suffering, more trauma, more victims who would carry their own wounds into the future. Sally Whitemane was a victim who had become a victimizer, a survivor who had lost herself in her survival. The light still answered her call, but it could not heal the wounds that mattered most. The dungeons beneath the Scarlet Monastery became places of unspeakable horror under Sally's reign. Prisoners brought there accused of plague corruption or scourge sympathies were subjected to interrogation techniques that had been refined over years of practice. James, vicious, who had earned the title of Master Interrogator, presided over these sessions with an enthusiasm that even some of his fellow crusaders found disturbing. Vicious had changed since his childhood days in Southshore. The gentle boy who had played games with Sally and Renault had become something twisted, a creature who found pleasure in the suffering of others. He justified his cruelty by calling it purification, claiming that the pain he inflicted was cleansing the souls of the accused. But those who saw him work knew the truth. Vicious enjoyed what he did, and the ideology of the crusade simply gave him permission to indulge his darkest impulses. Sally never publicly condemned Vicious's methods, and some whispered that she encouraged them. The screams that echoed up from the dungeons at night were simply the sounds of the light's work being done, she would say. Those who confessed to corruption were executed for their sins. Those who refused to confess were clearly hiding something and needed more intensive persuasion. Either way, the Crusade's judgment was final. The trials over which Sally presided were performances rather than genuine attempts to determine guilt or innocence. The accused were brought before her in chains, already weakened by days of interrogation, and asked to confess their crimes. Those who maintained their innocence were declared to be under the scourge's influence, their denial itself proof of corruption. Those who broke down and confessed to crimes they had never committed were declared guilty by their own admission. The outcome was the same either way. Despite the horrors she sanctioned, Sally maintained a self-image of righteousness that never wavered. She saw herself as a healer and protector, defending the innocent from the corruption that had destroyed her family. The fact that her methods created more suffering than they prevented was simply invisible to her. The psychological defense mechanisms she had constructed around her trauma were too strong to be penetrated by mere evidence. The Crusaders who served under Sally were a mix of true believers and opportunists. Some had genuinely internalized the organization's paranoid worldview, convinced that the plague had infected everyone outside the Crusade's ranks. Others simply found the monastery a safe place to ride out the chaos that had consumed Lordaeron, willing to participate in whatever was required to maintain their position. A few recognized that something was deeply wrong with their organization, but felt trapped, afraid that leaving would mark them as traitors, deserving of the same treatment they had witnessed being inflicted on others. The economy of the Scarlet Monastery was largely self-sufficient, with farms and workshops within its walls producing most of what the Crusaders needed to survive. Trade with the outside world was minimal, limited to occasional exchanges with merchants brave or desperate enough to approach the fortress. These traders were treated with suspicion, searched thoroughly for any signs of contamination, and often departed with stories about the strange and frightening people who lived behind the monastery's walls. Life for ordinary crusaders followed a rigid routine of prayer, training, and labor. Every day began with dawn services in the cathedral, where Sally or another senior priest would lead the assembled faithful in prayers for victory over the scourge. After morning prayers came training, as warriors practiced their combat skills and priests refined their command of holy magic. The afternoons were devoted to whatever work the individual crusader had been assigned, whether that was farming, smithing, cooking, or one of the countless other tasks that kept the community functioning. The religious services that Sally conducted were elaborate affairs filled with ritual and symbolism that reinforced the Crusades' ideology. She preached sermons about the necessity of vigilance, the ever present threat of corruption, the sacred duty of every crusader to root out evil wherever it was found. Her words were beautiful in their construction and terrible in their implications, painting a picture of a world so thoroughly infected by the scourge that only the Crusades' extreme measures could hope to save it. New recruits to the crusade underwent an indoctrination process designed to strip away their previous identities and remake them as true believers. They were isolated from outside influences, subjected to intensive religious instruction, and gradually introduced to the more extreme aspects of Crusader ideology. By the time they were fully accepted into the organization, most recruits had internalized the paranoia and hatred that defined it. Those who couldn't adapt were deemed unsuitable and dealt with accordingly. The Scarlet Monastery's architecture reflected the organization's dual nature as both a religious institution and a military fortress. The cathedral where Sally held court was a magnificent structure, its vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows celebrating the glory of the light. But the walls were thick enough to withstand a siege, and the windows were too narrow to admit invaders. Beauty and functionality coexisted uneasily, much like the healing and destructive aspects of Sally's own power. The library wing contained the remnants of the monastery's pre-Crusade collection, though many volumes had been removed or destroyed as potentially corrupted. What remained was heavily censored, with passages that contradicted Crusader doctrine carefully excised. The scholars who worked in the library spent their time copying approved texts and searching for any hidden references to plague magic or scourge sympathy in the surviving works. Accusations based on their findings were common, and the accused rarely escaped conviction. The armory was perhaps the most straightforward wing of the complex, dedicated purely to the practical concerns of warfare. Here the Crusades' blacksmiths forged weapons and armor, their work blessed by priests to give it extra effectiveness against the undead. The weapons produced in the armory were distinctive in their design, marked with the Crusades' iconography and enchanted with holy power. Warriors who carried them into battle against the scourge reported that the blades seemed almost eager to destroy undead flesh. And then there was the graveyard, that perpetual battleground where the Crusades' dead were interred, and where the undead continually rose to challenge the living. The priests assigned to the graveyard spent their days patrolling for signs of necromantic activity, destroying any corpses that showed signs of animation. It was exhausting work, both physically and spiritually, and the crusaders who served there tended to burn out quickly. But Sally insisted that the graveyard be held, that every inch of the monastery be defended from the encroachment of death. Through all of this, Sally Whitemane remained the unchallenged authority over the monastery and its inhabitants. Her word was law, her judgment was final, and her power was absolute. She had built a small kingdom within the chaos of ruined Lordaeron, a place where her vision of righteousness could be enforced without interference. That the kingdom was built on fanaticism and cruelty was invisible to her. That it would eventually attract enemies powerful enough to challenge her was a possibility she chose not to consider. Years passed in the Scarlet Monastery, and the pattern of violence and paranoia continued unbroken. Adventurers came seeking to eliminate the Crusade's leadership, and some even succeeded in striking Sally down. But her resurrection powers always brought her back, denying her enemies the permanent victory they sought. She seemed truly unkillable, protected by the very light she wielded so mercilessly. But one day, a ghost came to the monastery, or rather, a man carrying a ghost within him. Lordaeron Mograine was the younger son of Alexandros, the brother whom Renault had falsely claimed was captured by the Scourge all those years ago. Lordaeron had not been captured, of course. The entire story had been a lie designed to lure his father to his death. But Lordaeron had eventually learned the truth, and he had come to the monastery to confront his brother's treachery. He carried with him the corrupted Ashbringer, that terrible blade that had once been a beacon of hope and was now a weapon of darkness. Within its steel, bound by the corruption that had transformed it, rested the soul of Alexandros Mograine himself. The father who had been murdered by his own son now dwelt within the weapon that had killed him, a prisoner of the evil that had resulted from his death. When Lordaeron entered the cathedral, bearing the Ashbringer, the blade spoke to those around him. The spirit of Alexandros, still somehow conscious, within the corrupted weapon, could sense its surroundings, could feel the presence of familiar souls. And when it sensed Renault Mograine, the son who had betrayed and murdered him, something stirred within the corrupted steel. Renault recognized the sword immediately. How could he not? He had wielded it himself on that terrible day, had driven it through his father's heart. The sight of the Ashbringer in his brother's hands filled him with terror, for he knew that the weapon remembered what he had done. The confrontation that followed was inevitable. Renault attacked his brother, desperate to silence the witness to his crime before the truth could be revealed. But even as the brothers fought, the Ashbringer began to glow with a light it had not shone since Alexandros' death. The spirit within was awakening, called forth by the presence of its murderer. Before the assembled crusaders, before Sally Whitemane and all her followers, the ghost of Alexandros Mograine emerged from the corrupted blade. The shade of the fallen High Lord stood before his eldest son, radiating a fury that transcended death. Even as a spirit, Alexandros was terrible to behold, and Renault knew that his judgment had finally come. The confession came pouring out of Renault, a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. He spoke of treachery, of his manipulation by Dathrohan, of his jealousy and his hatred and his terrible choice. He begged his father to understand, to forgive, to show the mercy that the light was supposed to embody. Alexandros' response was as cold as the grave. He acknowledged Renault's knowledge of treachery, noting with bitter irony that his son was well qualified to speak on the subject. And when Renault begged for forgiveness, begged to be allowed to live, Alexandros replied with words that would echo through history. He forgave his son, and then he beheaded him. The execution was swift and brutal, a father's judgment upon a son who had betrayed everything that should have been sacred between them. Renault Mograine, Scarlet Commander, patricide, fell dead upon the floor of the cathedral where he had wielded such power. The crime that had haunted the Scarlet Crusade since its early days was finally revealed and finally punished. Sally Whitemane witnessed all of this, saw the ghost of the hero she had revered execute the companion she had served alongside. The revelation of Renault's treachery must have shaken her, must have forced her to question the foundations of her faith. If the Scarlet Commander had been a murderer, a traitor who had killed his own father, what did that say about the cause she had devoted her life to? But if Sally experienced any crisis of faith in that moment, it did not show. She remained committed to the crusade, remained dedicated to the destruction of the undead, remained the fearsome High Inquisitor who held the monastery in her iron grip. Perhaps she convinced herself that Renault's treachery was an isolated case, that the crusade itself remained pure. Perhaps she simply could not bear to admit that she had been wrong, that her life's work had been built on corruption and lies. Renault was replaced as Scarlet Commander by a new officer named Durand, who took up the military command of the monastery. Sally continued in her role as High Inquisitor, her power undiminished by the scandal of Renault's exposure. The Crusade's activities continued as before, the torture and the executions, and the endless war against anyone suspected of corruption. But the world around the Scarlet Crusade was changing. The truth about Balnazar's infiltration eventually came to light when adventurers confronted the Grand Crusader in Stratholme and discovered the demon wearing Sidon Dathrohan's corpse. The revelation that the Crusade's supreme leader had been a dreadlord all along should have destroyed the organization entirely. Instead, it only deepened the survivors' paranoia, convincing them that the outside world was even more corrupted than they had believed. The Scarlet Crusade's power waned as the years passed. Other forces, such as the Argent Dawn and later the Argent Crusade, proved more effective at fighting the Scourge without succumbing to fanaticism. The kingdoms of the living worlds, both Alliance and Horde, recognized the Scarlet Crusade as a threat rather than an ally. Slowly, the organization that had once represented hope for Lordaeron's survivors shrank to a shadow of its former self. Through it all, Sally Whitemane remained at the Scarlet Monastery, the last true power in a dying organization. Her resurrection abilities continued to bring her back from every defeat, making her seem immortal, even as everything around her crumbled. She became not merely a leader, but a symbol, the living embodiment of the Crusade's refusal to accept reality. But even Sally Whitemane was not truly unkillable. There existed weapons that could overcome even her, powers of resurrection, artifacts designed specifically to counter her abilities. And there was someone who hated her enough to seek those weapons out. Lillian Voss had been a daughter of the Scarlet Crusade, raised within its ranks, trained in its methods, indoctrinated in its beliefs. Her father, High Priest Benedictus Voss, had been one of the organization's leaders, and Lillian had been groomed from childhood to take her place among the faithful. She had believed everything the Crusade taught, had accepted without question that the undead were monsters to be destroyed without mercy. The parallel between Lillian and Sally was striking, though neither woman would have appreciated the comparison. Both had been shaped by the Crusade's ideology from their earliest years. Both had internalized the hatred of the undead that defined the organization's purpose. Both had lost everything to the forces of death, and both would ultimately find their fates intertwined in ways that neither could have predicted. But where Sally had responded to her trauma by embracing the Crusade's extremism more fully, by becoming a monster in the name of fighting monsters, Lillian would take a different path. Her journey would force her to confront the very beliefs that had defined her existence, to question whether the certainties she had been taught had any connection to reality. Then Lillian had died, and she had risen as one of the very creatures she had been taught to hate. The experience of becoming undead shattered everything Lillian had believed. She discovered that death did not automatically make someone a monster, that the consciousness and personality of the living could survive the transition to undeath. She was still herself, still capable of thought and feeling and choice, despite the Crusade's teaching that the undead were mindless abominations. Her father, faced with the daughter he had raised now existing as the enemy he had sworn to destroy, made his choice. He ordered Lillian executed, choosing his faith over his family, his ideology over his love. The betrayal broke something in Lillian that would never heal. She escaped her execution and began a campaign of vengeance against the Crusade that had raised her and then tried to murder her. Lillian's powers grew as her hatred deepened. She developed abilities that seemed drawn from darkness rather than light, shadow magic that reflected the rage consuming her soul. She began hunting crusaders, striking from the shadows and leaving death in her wake. The organization that had once been her family became her obsession, and she swore to destroy every member who had participated in the ideology that had nearly killed her. Eventually, Lillian's path led her to Sally Whitemane, the High Inquisitor who embodied everything the Crusade stood for. Sally represented the fanaticism that had convinced Lillian's father to order her death, the hatred that saw no difference between the mindless scourge and the thinking undead. If Lillian could destroy Sally, she would be striking at the heart of everything she hated. But Sally was not an easy target. Her resurrection powers meant that ordinary methods of killing her were useless. She had been struck down countless times before and had always returned, called back from death by her own prayers. To truly end Sally Whitemane, Lillian needed weapons that could overcome even the High Inquisitor's miraculous abilities. Such weapons existed. The blades of the Anointed were a pair of swords that had been specifically designed to counter resurrection magic. They were called Unquenchable and Hand of Providence, and together they could prevent even the most powerful healer from returning from death. The weapons were kept within the Scarlet Monastery itself, making them dangerous to retrieve, but not impossible for someone with Lillian's skills. Lillian recruited adventurers to help her infiltrate the monastery and recover the blades. Together, they fought their way through the Crusade's defenses, cutting down the fanatics who stood in their way. The battle was fierce, but Lillian's hatred drove her forward, and the adventurers proved more than capable of handling the resistance they encountered. When they finally reached the cathedral, they found Sally Whitemane waiting for them with Commander Durand at her side. The High Inquisitor faced her attackers with the same calm confidence she had always displayed, secure in her faith and her power. She had faced challenges before and had always emerged victorious. She had no reason to believe this time would be different. The battle that followed was brutal. Durand fell first, struck down by the combined assault of Lillian and the adventurers. Sally responded as she always did, casting Deep Sleep to incapacitate her enemies, before raising her fallen champion with her resurrection prayer. "Arise, my champion," she cried, and Durand's eyes opened once more. But this time, The resurrection only delayed the inevitable. The adventurers broke free of Sally's sleep spell and resumed their attack, overwhelming the High Inquisitor with superior numbers and relentless aggression. Sally fought back with everything she had, calling upon the light to heal her wounds and smite her enemies. But one by one, her spells failed her, and eventually she fell. What happened next was what made this death different from all the others. As Sally's spirit began its familiar journey back to her body, as her resurrection powers activated for perhaps the 1,000th time, Lillian stepped forward with the blades of the Anointed in her hands. With a cry of triumph and hatred, she drove both blades into Sally Whitemane's corpse. The effect was immediate and terrible. The blades of the Anointed, drinking Sally's blood, severed her connection to the resurrection magic that had sustained her for so long. The spell that had always brought her back was broken, cut off at the source by weapons designed specifically to prevent it. For the first time in her long and bloody career, Sally Whitemane was truly dead. Lillian withdrew the blades from Sally's body and examined them. The weapons had changed, their appearance altered by the act of drinking the High Inquisitor's blood. The long white blades had transformed into jagged purple-black short swords, as if the corruption of Sally's soul had been drawn into the steel. Lillian claimed the transformed weapons, recognizing them as tools that would serve her in her continued crusade against the undead. The death of Sally Whitemane should have been the end of her story. She had finally been killed in a way that prevented her return, struck down by weapons specifically designed to overcome her powers. The High Inquisitor was no more, and the Scarlet Monastery lost its most powerful defender. The Crusaders who witnessed Sally's death experienced a crisis of faith that shook the organization to its foundations. If their High Inquisitor, the woman whose resurrection powers had seemed to prove the light's favor, could be struck down permanently, what did that say about the righteousness of their cause? Some concluded that Sally had secretly been corrupted, that the light had withdrawn its protection from her because of some hidden sin. Others argued that the blades of the Anointed were demonic weapons, that their use against Sally was evidence of the enemy's desperate fear rather than a legitimate victory. Neither explanation was satisfying, but the Crusade's ideology demanded explanations. The alternative, that Sally had simply been killed by enemies more powerful than her, implied that power, rather than righteousness, determined the outcome of conflicts. And that implication threatened everything the Crusade believed about itself and its mission. Lillian Voss, standing over Sally's cooling corpse, felt none of the triumph she had expected. The woman who had embodied everything she hated was dead at last, yet the victory seemed hollow. Killing Sally would not bring back the life Lillian had lost, would not restore the family that had betrayed her, would not undo the countless crimes that the Crusade had committed. It was simply one death among many, one act of violence in an endless cycle that seemed to have no purpose beyond its own perpetuation. But death, in the world of Azeroth, is not always the end. The period between Sally Whitemane's death at Lillian's hands and the events that would follow was a time of significant change for the Scarlet Crusade. Without their most powerful leader, without the High Inquisitor, whose resurrection abilities had made the monastery seem impregnable, the organization struggled to maintain its grip on its remaining territories. High Commander Goodchild attempted to fill the void that Sally's death had created, but he lacked her charisma, her power, and her ability to inspire fanatical devotion. The Crusaders who had followed Sally did so out of fear and faith in equal measure, believing that her ability to raise the dead was proof of the light's favor. Without that miracle worker to lead them, many began to question whether the cause they had dedicated their lives to was truly righteous. The Forsaken and other enemies of the Crusade took advantage of this weakness, launching raids against Crusader holdings that would have been repulsed when Sally was alive. The monastery itself was attacked multiple times, each assault chipping away at the organization's strength. The legendary fortress that had withstood countless challenges began to feel more like a tomb than a bastion. Within the Crusade's ranks, there was debate about what to do next. Some argued that they should seek out new allies, that their isolation had made them vulnerable, and that they needed to reconnect with the broader world. Others insisted that any contact with outsiders risked contamination, that the only safe course was to become even more insular than before. The paralysis that resulted from these competing visions allowed the Crusade's decline to accelerate. Sally Whitemane's body was preserved within the cathedral, treated with reverence by those who still believed she might somehow return. The Crusaders could not accept that their High Inquisitor was truly gone, that the blades of the Anointed had severed her connection to resurrection permanently. They prayed over her corpse daily, hoping for a miracle that would never come from the sources they expected. The years that passed saw the Scarlet Crusade shrink to a fraction of its former size. Many of its outer holdings were abandoned as the organization concentrated its remaining forces in the monastery itself. Some Crusaders defected to other organizations, seeking purpose elsewhere. Others simply died, killed in battles they could no longer win or succumbing to disease and despair. Those who remained became even more extreme in their beliefs, convincing themselves that their suffering was a test of faith that they must endure. The ideology that had always been at the heart of the crusade intensified, becoming so divorced from reality that even casual observers could see the madness. The Scarlet Crusade had become a death cult, its members waiting for an end they could feel approaching but refused to acknowledge. When the Burning Legion launched its third invasion of Azeroth, the Scarlet Crusade barely noticed. The demons were attacking across the world, but the Crusaders were focused entirely on their own struggles against the undead. They did not understand that the Legion and the Scourge were connected, that the demons had created the plague that had destroyed Lordaeron in the first place. Their worldview was too narrow to encompass threats that did not fit their obsessive focus on the walking dead. The irony was profound. The Scarlet Crusade had been founded to protect humanity from the Scourge, which had been created by the Burning Legion. Now, as the Legion launched its greatest assault on Azeroth, the Crusade was too weakened and too diluted to contribute meaningfully to the defense. The organization that should have been at the forefront of the fight against demons was instead hiding in its monastery, waiting for enemies that had already been largely defeated. It was in this context that the Knights of the Ebon Blade came to claim Sally Whitemane's body. The Death Knights needed champions for their new 4 horsemen, warriors whose spirits were strong enough to serve even in death. Sally Whitemane, for all her faults, had possessed exactly that kind of strength. Her will had been formidable enough to call herself back from death repeatedly through the power of faith alone. Such a spirit, properly harnessed, could become something truly powerful. The Burning Legion's third invasion of Azeroth brought catastrophe on a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. Demons poured through portals across the world, overwhelming defenders and devastating entire regions. The combined forces of the Alliance and Horde struggled to hold back the tide, and many of the world's greatest heroes fell in the initial onslaught. Among the casualties was Tyrion Fordring, the Ashbringer redeemed, the hero who had purified the blade that bore his title and had led the assault on Icecrown Citadel against the Lich King himself. Tyrion was captured during the battle for the Broken Shore, subjected to fell corruption by the demons, and ultimately died from his wounds. His death left the world's defenders without one of their most powerful champions at the very moment they needed him most. The Knights of the Ebon Blade, the order of Death Knights who had broken free from the Lich King's control, recognized that desperate times called for desperate measures. They had served as warriors against the Scourge and had proven their value in countless battles. Now, facing the Legion's invasion, they sought to increase their strength by reviving a tradition from the old Scourge, the Four Horsemen. The original Four Horsemen had been elite Death Knights who served the Lich King directly, champions of such power that they had terrorized even the most hardened veterans. Alexandros Mograine, wielding the corrupted Ashbringer, had been among them for a time, along with other fallen heroes twisted to the Scourge's service. When the Lich King fell, the Four Horsemen had fallen with him, their power broken alongside their masters. But the concept of the Four Horsemen, a quartet of supreme Death Knights serving a single purpose, remained viable. The Ebon Blade decided to create a new version of this elite force, recruiting champions who could serve as their ultimate weapon against the Legion. They needed warriors of exceptional power, individuals whose spirits were strong enough to survive death and return as something greater than they had been in life. The first candidate they chose was General Nazgrim, the Orcish warrior who had served the Horde with distinction before falling at the siege of Orgrimmar. Nazgrim had been a soldier to his core, loyal unto death and beyond, and his resurrection as a Death Knight gave him new purpose in the war against the demons. The second candidate was Thoris Trollbane, the former king of Stromgard, a legendary warrior whose skill with a blade was matched only by his devotion to his kingdom. Trollbane had died defending his people, and his spirit had never found peace. The Ebon Blade offered him a chance to continue fighting, and he accepted. For their third candidate, the Ebon Blade made a choice that carried deep irony. They selected Sally Whitemane, the High Inquisitor who had dedicated her life to destroying the undead, whose hatred of creatures like them had been legendary. She had been killed by the blades of the Anointed, her resurrection powers severed by weapons designed specifically to counter them. But the Ebon Blade had their own methods of raising the dead, methods that did not depend on the light's blessings. Thessarion, one of the most renowned Death Knights in the Ebon Blade's ranks, led the mission to retrieve Sally's body. The remnants of the Scarlet Crusade still occupied the monastery, led now by High Commander Goodchild, and they fought desperately to prevent the desecration of their fallen leader. But the Death Knights were too powerful, their purpose too clear. The last Crusaders fell before their assault, and Sally Whitemane's corpse was claimed for the Ebon Blade's purposes. The Death Lord, the supreme champion of the Ebon Blade, who led the Order during the Legion's invasion, performed the ritual that would raise Sally Whitemane as a Death Knight. It was a profound act of transformation, one that would change everything Sally had been and everything she had believed. The Priestess of the Light, the champion of the Scarlet Crusade, the relentless hunter of the undead, would become the very thing she had hated most. The resurrection was successful. Sally Whitemane's eyes opened, now glowing with the cold blue light that marked all Death Knights. She rose from the altar where her body had been laid, her limbs moving with the unnatural grace of the undead. She was no longer the High Inquisitor, no longer a servant of the light in the way she had been. She was something new, something different, something that should have been impossible. But if the Ebon Blade expected gratitude or immediate cooperation, they were surprised by what they found. The Sally Whitemane who rose from death was not the same fanatic who had ruled the Scarlet Monastery. Something had changed in her, something fundamental. The madness that had consumed her in life, the paranoia and the hatred and the absolute certainty of her own righteousness had faded away. Death had freed Sally Whitemane from her insanity, the trauma that had driven her to extremism, the guilt and rage that had fueled her fanaticism, had somehow been purified by the process of death and resurrection. She could think clearly now, could recognize the terrible things she had done in the name of the light. She remembered the innocent people she had tortured and killed, the lives she had destroyed in her crusade against imagined corruption. The weight of those memories pressed down upon her, but they no longer controlled her. The transformation was profound beyond anything the Ebon Blade had expected. When they raised most warriors, they found minds shaped by the same basic patterns they had held in life. The angry remained angry, the peaceful struggled against their new nature, and the confused stayed confused. But Sally Whitemane had emerged from her resurrection fundamentally altered, as if death itself had performed the therapy that life had denied her. The clarity she now possessed was almost painful in its intensity. She could see the trajectory of her existence with perfect precision, could trace the line from the traumatized girl who had destroyed her undead family to the monster who had tortured innocents in the name of the light. Every choice she had made, every crime she had committed, every victim she had created stood before her in merciless detail. There was no denial possible, no rationalization that could shield her from the truth of what she had been. In the first hours after her resurrection, Sally wept. Death Knights were not supposed to be capable of tears, their undead bodies lacking the biological functions that produced them. But Sally somehow managed it, her body responding to her grief in ways that defied the normal limitations of undeath. She wept for her family, whose deaths had started her down the path of madness. She wept for her victims, the innocent people who had suffered and died because of her paranoia. She wept for herself, for the young priestess who had wanted only to serve the light and had instead become its darkest perversion. The other Death Knights watched her with a mixture of fascination and unease. They had never seen a newly raised warrior react this way, had never witnessed the kind of emotional catharsis that Sally was experiencing. Some wondered if the resurrection had failed somehow, if her mind had been damaged by the transition. Others suspected that they were witnessing something unprecedented, the emergence of a Death Knight, unlike any that had come before. The Death Lord, the supreme champion who had performed Sally's resurrection, approached her with careful respect. They had expected resistance, had prepared themselves to break a fanatic's will and bend it to the Ebon Blade's purposes. Instead, they found a woman who had already broken herself, who had shattered the walls of her own delusion, and was now surveying the wreckage with horrified clarity. Sally spoke to the Death Lord with a voice that held none of the imperious authority that had characterized the High Inquisitor. She asked questions about that Ebon Blade's purpose, about the war against the Legion, about the role she was expected to play. Her tone was humble, almost tentative, a stark contrast to the woman who had commanded the Scarlet Monastery with iron certainty. The answers she received seemed to satisfy her. The Burning Legion was the true enemy, the force behind everything she had suffered. The demons had created the scourge, had engineered the plague that destroyed her family, had set in motion the chain of events that had twisted her into a monster. Fighting them was not merely acceptable, but righteous, a cause that even her newly awakened conscience could embrace. Sally accepted her new existence as a Death Knight with a surprising degree of equanimity. She understood what had been done to her, understood the irony of her situation, understood that she had become exactly the kind of creature she had spent her life destroying. But she also recognized that she had been given an opportunity for redemption, a chance to atone for the sins of her past by serving a greater purpose. The Burning Legion, after all, had been ultimately responsible for everything that had happened to her. The demons had created the scourge as a weapon, had engineered the plague that had killed her family, had set in motion the events that had destroyed Lordaeron, and twisted Sally herself into a monster. In fighting the Legion, she would be striking at the root cause of all her suffering. When she spoke of her feelings toward the demons, Sally's words carried a cold fury that had nothing to do with her former fanaticism. She declared that there was no greater hatred in the world than that which existed in her heart, that the Burning Legion would pay for everything they had taken from her. Her judgment awaited in the afterlife, she acknowledged, but the Legion's judgment was at hand, and she would be the executioner's blade. The transformation of Sally Whitemane from Zealot to Death Knight represented one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of Azeroth's conflict with the undead. The woman who had tortured and killed in the name of destroying creatures like herself now stood alongside them as an ally and a sister in arms. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Sally herself. But there was another irony that perhaps cut even deeper. As a Death Knight, Sally Whitemane retained an ability that should have been impossible for one of her kind. Despite her undeath, despite the dark powers that now animated her corpse, she could still channel the light. Most Death Knights were utterly cut off from the light, their connection to it severed by the corruption of their resurrection. The holy power that had sustained them in life was replaced by the cold magic of death, and any attempt to call upon the light resulted only in agony. But Sally was different. Her faith had been so strong, her connection to the light so deep, that even death could not sever it entirely. She could still heal, still bless, still call upon the power that she had wielded as a priestess. This made her unique among the four horsemen, a warrior who could combine the darkness of death magic with the brilliance of holy power. She brought to the group not merely her combat abilities, but a spiritual dimension that the others lacked. In a way, she served as their priest, tending to their needs in ways that went beyond the purely martial. Sally Whitemane had found a new purpose, a new family, a new reason to exist. The four horsemen would become her cause, and the war against the Legion would become her crusade. The fanaticism was gone, but the warrior remained. The fourth horseman was supposed to be Tyrion Fordring himself, raised from death to serve once more as the ultimate champion against evil. The Ebon Blade's plan called for assaulting Light's Hope Chapel, the sacred ground where Tyrion had been laid to rest, and retrieving his body for resurrection. It was a bold plan, perhaps foolhardy, but the stakes of the Legion invasion demanded extraordinary measures. Light's Hope Chapel had been holy ground since long before the founding of the Scarlet Crusade, or even the Silver Hand. The site was saturated with the light's power, blessed by the presence of countless martyrs who had been buried in its crypts over the centuries. It served as the headquarters of the reformed Silver Hand under Lady Liadrin, and its defenders included some of the most powerful paladins in the world. The four horsemen, still incomplete, led the assault. Renault Mograine, who had become the Ebon Blade's High Lord after a complex history involving his father's sword and his own death and resurrection, commanded the attack. Nazgrim and Thoris Trollbane provided the martial strength that the mission required, and Sally Whitemane, the newest of the horsemen, brought her unique combination of death magic and holy power. The battle was fierce from the first moment. The paladins defending Light's Hope fought with desperate courage, knowing that the sacred ground they protected was irreplaceable. Lady Liadrin herself took the field, her power as a blood knight augmented by her absolute faith in the cause she served. The Death Knights found themselves facing an enemy that would not yield, that would rather die than allow the desecration of their holy site. But the real obstacle was not the defenders. It was the light itself. The sacred ground of Light's Hope Chapel amplified holy power exponentially, making it the last place any servant of darkness would want to fight. The Death Knights felt the light pressing against them, searing their undead flesh, weakening their powers. Even Sally, who retained her connection to the light, found the experience uncomfortable. The holiness of the site did not welcome her as it once would have. Renault Mograine pressed forward despite the resistance, driven by his determination to complete the mission. He fought his way toward Tyrion's tomb, cutting through the defenders who stood in his path. But the closer he got to the sacred crypt, the stronger the light's resistance became. By the time he reached Tyrion's resting place, he was barely able to stand. The attempt to raise Tyrion Fordring failed. The light's power was too strong, the sanctity of the ground too profound. Any resurrection spell that Darion attempted simply dissolved in the radiance that surrounded the fallen paladin. Tyrion's body lay peaceful in its tomb, protected by a force that even death magic could not overcome. But failure was not the worst outcome of the assault. As the Death Knights fought to escape, Darion found himself increasingly overwhelmed by the light's power. His undead body could not withstand the concentrated holiness of the site, and the damage accumulated beyond what even his Death Knight resilience could handle. When he finally teleported his horsemen back to Acheris, the floating citadel that served as the Ebon Blade's headquarters, he collapsed. Sally examined Darian's broken form and reported what she found. The light had ravaged his body, she explained, causing damage that could not be repaired by conventional means. There was nothing they could do to save him. The High Lord of the Ebon Blade, son of the Ashbringer, was dying for the second time. But death, as Sally Whitemane had learned, was not always the end. The Death Lord, the supreme champion who led the Ebon Blade, performed another resurrection, raising Renault Mograine from the death that Light's Hope had dealt him. Darian rose once more, wounded in spirit if not in body, carrying the weight of his failure and the cost of his ambition. In the aftermath of the disaster at Light's Hope, the Ebon Blade was forced to reconsider their plans. They could not have Tyrion Fordring as their fourth horseman. They needed someone else, someone who could complete the quartet and bring the four horsemen to full strength. The choice fell upon Renault Mograine himself. Following in his father's footsteps, Darian took up the mantle that had been intended for Tyrion. He became the leader of the four horsemen, the greatest Death Knight among a group of supreme Death Knights. It was a bitter irony that Alexandros Mograine's son would fill the same role that Alexandros himself had once filled in the original Four Horsemen, but it was also a kind of redemption. The Mograine name would once more lead the champions of death against the forces that threatened Azeroth. With Darian as their leader, the Four Horsemen turned their full attention to the war against the Legion. They fought across the Broken Isles, that shattered archipelago where the conflict had centered, striking at demon strongholds and supporting the broader campaign against the invaders. Sally Whitemane found purpose in these battles, channeling her hatred of the Legion into action, proving herself worthy of the second chance that death had given her. The campaign against the Burning Legion was long and costly, but ultimately successful. The champions of Azeroth fought their way to the very heart of the demon world Argus, confronting the Dark Titan Sargeras himself at the climax of their struggle. Sargeras was imprisoned by the Pantheon. His threat ended at last, and the Burning Legion was shattered beyond recovery. The victory was not without cost. Azeroth itself had been wounded by Sargeras's final strike, a massive sword plunged into the planet that caused damage on a continental scale. The world that the heroes had fought to save was bleeding, its very essence leaking away through the wound the Dark Titan had inflicted. But for Sally Whitemane, the defeat of the Legion represented something personal. The force that had created the Scourge, that had engineered the plague that had destroyed her, family that had set in motion all the tragedies of her existence, was finally broken. Her vengeance was not complete, could never be complete, but it was at least partially achieved. The moment when Sargeras was finally imprisoned, when the threat that had loomed over Azeroth for millennia was at last contained, Sally felt something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. It was not joy exactly, for Death Knights were not well suited to joy, but it was something like peace, a lessening of the weight that had pressed down upon her since the day her family died. She stood on the shores of Argus as the champions of Azeroth celebrated their victory, watching the stars that had witnessed the final confrontation. The demons were scattered, their master bound, their invasion ended. The beings who had been ultimately responsible for everything Sally had suffered were defeated at last. It was not enough. Nothing could ever be enough to balance the scales of what she had lost. But it was something. It was proof that evil could be defeated, that darkness did not always triumph, that those who fought against the corruption of the universe could sometimes win. Sally had spent so long hating, so long destroying, so long consumed by her need for vengeance that she had almost forgotten why she had started down that path. Standing on Argus, watching the victory celebrations, she remembered. She had wanted to protect people. Before the trauma twisted her, before the hatred consumed her, before the Scarlet Crusade gave her permission to become a monster, Sally Whitemane had wanted to use the light to help those who could not help themselves. That girl had been buried beneath decades of violence and cruelty, but she was not entirely gone. Death had unearthed her, had brushed away the accumulated layers of madness, had given her back to herself. The four horsemen had proven themselves in the crucible of the Legion invasion. They had fought alongside the greatest heroes of Azeroth and had earned a place among them. Sally Whitemane, once the most feared fanatic in Lordaeron, now stood as a respected warrior in the struggle against darkness. But new threats were already emerging, and the four horsemen would be needed again before long. Sally's role among the four horsemen was unique in ways that went beyond her unusual relationship with the light. While the other horsemen had accepted their undeath with varying degrees of resignation, Sally brought a passion to her new existence that surprised even her fellow Death Knights. She threw herself into her duties with the same intensity she had once brought to the Scarlet Crusade, though now that intensity was directed at genuine enemies rather than imagined ones. Her combat abilities had evolved since her resurrection. The holy magic she had wielded in life, combined with the death magic that animated her corpse to create something unprecedented. She could heal her allies with prayers that should have been impossible for an undead creature to channel, could protect them with shields of holy light, even as she commanded the powers of plague and shadow. This duality made her invaluable in situations where the horsemen needed both offense and support. The relationship between Sally and her fellow horsemen developed into something resembling camaraderie, though none of them would have used such a warm word to describe it. Nazgrim respected her ferocity in battle, recognizing in her the same warrior spirit that had driven him to serve the Horde unto death. Thoris Trollbane appreciated her tactical mind, her ability to assess a battlefield and identify the critical points where force should be applied. And Renault Mograine, who had his own complicated history with the Scarlet Crusade, found in Sally someone who understood the weight of past sins. They did not speak often of personal matters. Death Knights were not known for emotional intimacy, and all four of them carried burdens that resisted easy discussion. But there was an understanding between them, a recognition that they were all serving together toward a common purpose. Sally found in the four horsemen something she had not experienced since her childhood in Southshore, genuine belonging to a group that valued her for who she was rather than what she could do for them. The battles they fought during the Legion invasion tested all of them to their limits. The demons they faced were powerful beyond anything Sally had encountered among the Scourge, creatures whose fell magic could wound even undead flesh. She learned to adapt her tactics, to use her unique abilities in ways she had never attempted before. The priestess, who had once relied purely on the light's power, now wielded death magic with equal facility, finding that the two forces complemented each other in unexpected ways. When the war finally ended with Sargeras's imprisonment, Sally experienced something she had not felt since her family's death, a sense of closure. The Burning Legion, the ultimate source of all her suffering, had been defeated. The plague that had killed her parents and siblings, the scourge that had driven her to madness, all of it traced back to the demons who were now shattered and scattered across the cosmos. Justice had been served, however imperfectly, but closure did not mean the end of her journey. The four horsemen were champions of the Ebon Blade, and the Ebon Blade served wherever it was needed. There were still threats to Azeroth, still enemies that required the kind of ruthless efficiency that Death Knights specialized in. Sally's war was not over, would never be over as long as she continued to exist. She had made her peace with that truth, and found in it a kind of freedom. The months that followed the Legion's defeat were a time of relative quiet for the horsemen. They maintained their readiness, trained together, and prepared for whatever threat would emerge next. Sally used this time to reflect on everything that had happened to her, to process the memories that she had carried from life into death. She did not forget the things she had done as High Inquisitor, could not forget them, but she learned to carry that weight without being crushed by it. She also explored her unique abilities more deeply, discovering aspects of her power that she had not suspected. Her connection to the light, impossible as it was, allowed her to sense things that other Death Knights could not perceive. She could feel the presence of holy artifacts, could detect when the light was being channeled nearby. This sensitivity proved useful in situations where the horsemen needed to avoid conflict with forces of the light, or when they needed to locate targets that were protected by holy wards. The other members of the Ebon Blade regarded Sally with a mixture of respect and wariness. She had been their enemy for so long, had killed so many of their number during her years as High Inquisitor, that some found it difficult to accept her as a comrade. But her actions since her resurrection had proven her loyalty, and her power made her too valuable to alienate. Slowly, grudgingly, she was accepted into the community of Death Knights that served aboard Acheris. When word came that the Alliance and Horde were once again at war, Sally felt a familiar frustration. The living had learned nothing from the Legion invasion, nothing from the countless conflicts that had weakened both factions. They were fighting each other when they should have been preparing for the next existential threat. But the four horsemen were not participants in the factional conflict, and Sally forced herself to focus on matters more relevant to their purpose. The defeat of the Burning Legion did not bring lasting peace to Azeroth. The wound that Sargeras had inflicted upon the world created new conflicts as the Alliance and Horde competed for the precious substance called azurite that bled from the planet. War erupted once more, this time between the factions that had stood together against the demons. For the four horsemen, the factional conflict was a distraction from more important concerns. The Lich King still sat upon the frozen throne in Ice-Crown Citadel, his power diminished but not destroyed. Bolvar Fordragon, the paladin who had taken up the helm of domination after Arthas's defeat, maintained control over the Scourge, preventing the mindless undead from overwhelming the world. But Bolvar's grip on the Scourge was not as absolute as Arthas's had been, and the threat of an uncontrolled undead outbreak remained. The four horsemen conceived a bold plan to eliminate this threat permanently. They would assault Ice-Crown Citadel, confront the Lich King directly, and destroy him once and for all. It was an ambitious goal, perhaps impossible, but the horsemen believed themselves equal to the challenge. Sally Whitemane, in particular, relished the prospect of facing the Lich King. In life, she had dedicated herself to fighting the undead, and the Lich King represented the ultimate source of that threat. Even in death, even as an undead creature herself, she wanted nothing more than to destroy the being who had caused so much suffering. The opportunity to strike at the Scourge's master was everything she had ever dreamed of. The four horsemen set out for Ice-Crown, making their way across the frozen wastes of Northrend toward the citadel that loomed over the continent. They were prepared for resistance, prepared for the minions of the Scourge to bar their path. What they were not prepared for was what they found when they arrived. Sylvanas Windrunner, the war chief of the Horde, had already come to Ice-Crown. The Dark Lady had her own plans for the Lich King, her own reasons for confronting Bolvar Fordragon. She stood before the frozen throne, facing the armored figure who had once been a noble paladin and demanded something from him. For Sally Whitemane, the sight of Sylvanas brought complicated emotions to the surface. The Dark Lady was herself a product of the Scourge's corruption, a ranger general of Quel'Thalas who had been murdered by Arthas and raised as a banshee to serve his will. She had eventually broken free of the Lich King's control and had founded the Forsaken, a nation of free-willed undead who existed in an uneasy alliance with the Horde. The Forsaken had been among the Scarlet Crusade's most hated enemies during Sally's years as High Inquisitor. She had condemned them as abominations, indistinguishable from the mindless Scourge, had ordered attacks against their settlements, had tortured any of their number who fell into Crusader hands. Now, standing in the shadow of Ice-Crown Citadel, she was forced to confront the reality that she herself had become what she had once despised, while Sylvanas represented a path she could never have imagined during her living years. The four horsemen arrived just in time to witness a confrontation that would change the nature of death itself. Sylvanas and Bolvar fought, their powers clashing in the heart of the citadel. The battle was fierce, but ultimately one-sided. Sylvanas possessed strength that Bolvar could not match, power drawn from sources that the horsemen could not identify. Sally watched the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and horror. Bolvar Fordragon had been a hero of the Alliance, a paladin who had sacrificed his own freedom to take up the helm of domination and prevent the Scourge from running rampant. He had chosen to become the Lich King not out of ambition or corruption, but out of pure selflessness, accepting eternal imprisonment to protect a world that would never know the full extent of his sacrifice. And now, Sylvanas was destroying him, was tearing away the helm that had defined his existence for nearly a decade. The four horsemen could only watch as the confrontation reached its climax. their own power insufficient to intervene in a battle between such titans. When the fighting ended, Sylvanas stood triumphant over the Lich King's fallen form. She reached down and tore the helm of domination from his head, holding it aloft like a trophy. And then, before the stunned eyes of the four horsemen, she ripped the helm apart with her bare hands. The sound of the helm's destruction was unlike anything Sally had ever heard, a tearing noise that seemed to echo through dimensions beyond the physical. The artifact that had controlled the Scourge since its creation, that had held the power of the Lich King across multiple wielders, was being unmade by sheer force. Sylvanas' expression as she destroyed the helm was impossible to read. Was it triumph, rage, relief, something else entirely? Sally could not tell, and perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was what came next. The destruction of the Helm of Domination unleashed a shockwave that rippled across Azeroth and beyond. The barrier between the world of the living and the realm of death, already weakened by the events of recent years, was shattered completely. The sky above Icecrown tore open, revealing a vision of the Shadowlands, the cosmic realm where souls traveled after death. The Scourge, freed from the Lich King's control, went berserk. The mindless undead that had been held in check by Bolvar's will were now truly mindless, attacking everything in their path without direction or purpose. The threat that the four horsemen had come to eliminate had been transformed into something far worse. Renault Mograine assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a seasoned commander. Sylvanas was gone, having stepped through some portal into the newly opened sky. The Lich King lay helpless without his helm, his power broken, and an army of uncontrolled undead was threatening to sweep across Azeroth. He ordered Nazgrim and Sally Whitemane to secure Bolvar Fordragon, to rescue the fallen Lich King before the Scourge could tear him apart. It was a strange mission, saving the man who had been the symbol of everything they opposed, but the situation demanded strange choices. Bolvar might still have knowledge that was needed, might still be useful in dealing with the crisis that Sylvanas had created. Sally and Nazgrim fought their way to Bolvar's side, cutting through the feral scourge that surrounded him. They found the former Lich King weakened and confused, stripped of the power that had defined him for so long. He was no longer the terrifying figure who had commanded the armies of the dead. He was just a man, scarred and broken, who had sacrificed everything to keep the world safe. The four horsemen brought Bolvar to safety, extracting him from the chaos that Sylvanas had unleashed. They did not know what would happen next, did not understand the full implications of what the Dark Lady had done, but they knew that the world had changed fundamentally, that the rules governing life and death had been rewritten in ways that no one fully understood. For Sally Whitemane, the destruction of the Helm of Domination represented both an ending and a beginning. The scourge that she had fought her entire life, that had taken her family and driven her to madness, was now leaderless. But the crisis that resulted threatened even more destruction than the scourge itself had ever caused. The four horsemen would have work to do in the days to come. The Shadowlands beckoned, and the war between life and death was entering a new phase. Sally Whitemane, once a priestess of the light, then a fanatic of the Scarlet Crusade, now a death knight of the Ebon Blade, would face challenges that even her twisted path had not prepared her for. But that is a story for another time. The tale of Sally Whitemane extends beyond the boundaries of World of Warcraft into other games and media created by Blizzard Entertainment. Her distinctive appearance and compelling backstory have made her a fan favorite character, appearing in multiple forms across the company's various properties. In Heroes of the Storm, Blizzard's team-based multiplayer game, Sally Whitemane was introduced as a playable hero in July 2018. Her implementation in the game captures her dual nature as a powerful healer and a zealous warrior. As a healer hero, Whitemane's kit revolves around a unique mechanic where she heals her allies by dealing damage to her enemies, reflecting her aggressive interpretation of the light's power. Her abilities in Heroes of the Storm reference her appearances in World of Warcraft. She can cast Desperate Plea to heal allies at the cost of increasing mana consumption, representing her willingness to push herself to extremes. Her Inquisition ability channels damage onto enemies while healing nearby allies, capturing the duality of her power. And her ultimate abilities include Divine Reckoning, which calls down holy fire on a location, and Scarlet Aegis, which shields her allies and herself. The character also received multiple skins in Heroes of the Storm, including Celestial Empress Whitemane, which reimagines her as a cosmic entity, and Cursed Witch Whitemane, which portrays her as a dark sorceress. Those alternate versions allow players to explore different interpretations of the character while maintaining her core identity as a powerful wielder of divine magic. In Hearthstone, Blizzard's digital card game, Sally Whitemane has appeared in multiple forms. She is available as an alternate hero for the Priest class, replacing Anduin Wrynn as the player's avatar. Her voice lines and emotes in this role reference her fanaticism and her resurrection abilities, bringing the character's personality to the card game format. Beyond the hero skin, Whitemane has appeared on various cards in Hearthstone, including versions that reference both her living and undead forms. The card game has explored different aspects of her character, from her role as High Inquisitor to her resurrection as a Death Knight. She has also appeared in Hearthstone's Mercenaries mode, where players can recruit and battle with various Warcraft characters. Sally Whitemane's appearances in the World of Warcraft trading card game, which predated Hearthstone, established her presence in collectible card games. She appeared alongside Renault Mograine in cards that referenced their partnership at the Scarlet Monastery. Those early representations helped cement her status as a notable character in the Warcraft universe. More recently, Sally Whitemane has appeared in Warcraft Arclight Rumble, the mobile game that features various characters from the Warcraft universe in a tower defense style format. Her inclusion in this game demonstrates her continued relevance to Blizzard's portfolio of Warcraft-related products. The popularity of Sally Whitemane among fans can be attributed to several factors. Her distinctive visual design, with her elaborate headpiece and flowing robes, makes her immediately recognizable. Her backstory, combining trauma, fanaticism, and eventual redemption, provides narrative depth that resonates with players. And her gameplay as a challenging boss encounter in the original Scarlet Monastery has created memories for millions of players who encountered her during their adventures in Azeroth. The Scarlet Monastery dungeon, where players first encountered Sally Whitemane, holds a special place in the memories of World of Warcraft veterans. During the game's original release and early expansions, the Monastery was one of the most frequently run dungeons in the game, visited by countless groups of adventurers seeking experience, equipment, and the satisfaction of defeating one of the Crusade's leaders. Sally's appearance at the end of the cathedral wing, her dramatic resurrection of Mograine, and her challenging abilities made her a memorable adversary. The famous phrase that accompanied her resurrection spell, "Arise, my champion," became one of the most quoted lines in World of Warcraft's history. Players would shout it in jest, would reference it in discussions of the game, would use it as a shorthand for any dramatic comeback or reversal. The line captured something essential about Sally's character: her absolute confidence in her own power, her determination to never accept defeat, her willingness to challenge death itself to achieve her goals. When Blizzard Entertainment redesigned the Scarlet Monastery for the Mists of Pandaria expansion, they updated Sally Whitemane's encounter while preserving the elements that had made her memorable. Her abilities were modernized, her appearance was refined, but the core of the experience remained the same. Players still faced a fanatical priestess who would stop at nothing to destroy them, who would raise her fallen allies to continue the fight, who would demonstrate the full power of her corrupted faith. The character's voice acting has also contributed to her popularity. Different voice actresses have portrayed Sally Whitemane across her various appearances, including Kath Soucie in the original World of Warcraft, Grey Delisle in Mists of Pandaria, and Erica Lindbeck in Heroes of the Storm. Each performance has brought different aspects of the character to life, from her imperious commands to her desperate resurrection cries. The original voice performance by Kath Soucie established the template that later actresses would follow. Soucie brought a quality of passionate intensity to Sally's lines, making her sound like a true believer rather than a simple villain. Her delivery of the resurrection phrase was both triumphant and desperate, capturing the complexity of a woman who refused to accept the death of her cause. Grey Delisle's work in Mists of Pandaria built upon this foundation while adding new dimensions. Sally sounded slightly older, slightly wearier, as if the years of fighting had begun to take their toll. But the core of fanaticism remained, the absolute certainty that the Crusade's cause was righteous and that all opposition must be destroyed. Erica Lindbeck's portrayal in Heroes of the Storm offered yet another interpretation. In a game where characters were taken out of their original context and placed in combat arenas, Lindbeck emphasized Sally's confident authority, her sense of being chosen for a sacred mission. Her voice lines included references to both the light and to resurrection, connecting the Heroes of the Storm version to the character's World of Warcraft origins. Sally Whitemane's design has influenced cosplay and fan art communities, with her elaborate costume and distinctive silhouette inspiring countless interpretations. The character represents a particular aesthetic within the Warcraft universe, combining religious imagery with military authority in a way that has proven visually compelling. The chapeau, that distinctive headpiece that frames Sally's face and flows down her back, has become one of the most recognizable elements of Warcraft visual design. Cosplayers have developed numerous techniques for recreating this complex piece, using materials ranging from foam to thermoplastics to 3D printing. The challenge of accurately reproducing the chapeau has become something of a rite of passage in Warcraft cosplay communities. Beyond the headpiece, Sally's robes present their own challenges for cosplayers. The layered garments, with their crimson and white color scheme and intricate detailing, require significant skill to reproduce accurately. Yet the popularity of Sally Whitemane cosplay demonstrates that many fans are willing to undertake this challenge, drawn by their connection to the character and their desire to embody her distinctive presence. Fan artists have similarly embraced Sally Whitemane as a subject, producing countless illustrations that explore different aspects of her character. Some focus on her role as High Inquisitor, depicting her in moments of power and authority. Others imagine scenes from her transformation into a Death Knight, capturing the moment when everything she believed was overturned. Still others create entirely original scenarios, placing Sally in situations that the official lore has never explored. The community's engagement with Sally Whitemane demonstrates something important about how fictional characters can resonate with audiences. Despite being a villain for most of her existence, despite the atrocities she committed in the name of her faith, Sally has become a beloved figure whose complexity is appreciated rather than condemned. Players understand that her evil was born from trauma, that her fanaticism was a response to unbearable loss, and that understanding does not require approval of her actions. The story of Sally Whitemane is ultimately a tragedy, the tale of a girl who lost everything and was destroyed by her attempts to prevent others from suffering as she had suffered. She began as an innocent child, playing games of heroism in the streets of Southshore, and she ended as a Death Knight, serving the very forces she had once sworn to destroy. Her journey from light to darkness, to something beyond both, is one of the most complex character arcs in the history of Azeroth. To understand Sally Whitemane is to understand the nature of trauma and how it shapes those who survive it. She was not born with the capacity for the cruelty she would later display. She did not choose to become a monster. Rather, she was shaped by forces beyond her control, molded by experiences that would have broken most people entirely. The fact that she survived it all is a testament to her strength. The fact that her survival took the form it did is a testament to the power of unprocessed pain. The scourge that destroyed her family was more than a military force. It was a deliberate attack on the very concept of death as a transition to something better. Before the plague, the people of Lordaeron had believed that their departed loved ones went to a peaceful rest, that death was not an ending but a passage to another form of existence. The scourge shattered that belief by turning the dead into weapons against the living, by making every corpse a potential enemy, by corrupting the sacred rituals that had comforted the grieving for generations. Sally Whitemane experienced this corruption in its most personal and devastating form. She was not merely a witness to the plague's horrors, but a participant in them, forced to destroy her own family with her own hands. The act of killing her undead parents and siblings was simultaneously the right thing to do, and an unforgivable betrayal of everything she had been taught about family and duty. This impossible contradiction lodged itself in her psyche and could not be resolved by any means available to her. The Scarlet Crusade offered her a way to externalize her internal conflict. By dedicating herself to the destruction of the undead, she could transform her guilt into purpose, her rage into righteousness. Every zombie she struck down was a proxy for the family members she had been forced to destroy. Every scourge creature she burned with the light's fire was another payment on a debt she could never fully discharge. The crusade gave her permission to hate, and she embraced that permission with the desperation of someone drowning. But hatred, even righteous hatred, is corrosive to the soul. It demands more and more to be satisfied, expanding its targets to include ever wider circles of potential enemies. Sally's hatred of the undead became hatred of anyone who might be infected with the plague, then hatred of anyone who associated with the infected, then hatred of anyone who failed to share her hatred with sufficient intensity. The circle of the acceptable shrank while the circle of the condemned expanded, until Sally could see enemies everywhere and allies almost nowhere. The trauma of witnessing her family's death and being forced to destroy them herself left wounds that never healed. Sally dealt with those wounds by transforming her pain into hatred, by dedicating her life to the destruction of the undead who had taken everything from her. But hatred is a poor foundation for a life, and Sally's devotion to vengeance led her down increasingly dark paths. The Scarlet Crusade offered her a structure for her rage, a cause that justified her worst impulses. Under its banner, she tortured and killed innocents, convinced that she was serving the light, even as she violated everything the light was supposed to represent. Her power grew, but her humanity diminished until she became something monstrous in her own right. The irony of her eventual resurrection as a Death Knight is profound. The woman who had dedicated her existence to destroying the undead became one of them, raised to serve purposes she had once fought against. But that resurrection also offered something that life had denied her: clarity. Death freed Sally from the madness that had consumed her, allowed her to see clearly for the first time since her family's destruction. The Sally Whitemane who serves among the Four Horsemen is not the same person who ruled the Scarlet Monastery. She carries the memories of her crimes, the weight of all the suffering she caused, but she is no longer controlled by the trauma that drove her to those crimes. She has found a new purpose, a new family, a new reason to exist that does not require her to be a monster. Whether this represents redemption is a question that has no easy answer. Sally cannot undo the harm she did in life, cannot resurrect the innocents she condemned to death, cannot heal the wounds she inflicted upon the world. The best she can do is try to be different now, to use her power for purposes that are genuinely righteous rather than merely violent. The Scarlet Crusade that Sally Whitemane helped to build has largely crumbled in her absence. The organization that once represented hope for Lordaeron's survivors became a byword for fanaticism and cruelty, its reputation stained beyond recovery. A few remnants persist here and there, but the crusade as a meaningful force is gone, destroyed by its own extremism as much as by its enemies. What remains is the memory of what might have been. The Scarlet Crusade could have been a force for good, an organization dedicated to protecting the innocent and opposing the scourge. Instead, it became a tool of demons and a haven for fanatics, its noble purpose corrupted from within. Sally Whitemane's story is in many ways the story of the crusade itself, a tale of good intentions gone terribly wrong. The lesson of Sally Whitemane's life, if there is one, concerns the dangers of trauma untreated and hatred unchecked. She was not born evil, was not corrupted by outside forces in the way that Arthas Menethil was corrupted by Frostmourne. She made choices, each one seeming justified at the time, that led her step by step into darkness. The horror she experienced did not excuse the horrors she committed. The comparison to Arthas is instructive. Both Sally and Arthas were children of Lordaeron, who witnessed the destruction of everything they loved. Both took up arms against the scourge with the intention of protecting the innocent. Both ultimately became monsters who caused as much suffering as the enemy they fought. But where Arthas was actively corrupted by Frostmourne, seduced by a dark intelligence that promised him the power to save his people, Sally corrupted herself through the slow accumulation of unexamined trauma. In some ways, Sally's fall was more tragic because it was more preventable. No demon whispered in her ear. No cursed weapon twisted her soul. She simply responded to unbearable pain in the only way she knew how, and no one intervened to offer her a different path. The Scarlet Crusade validated her hatred instead of healing it, encouraged her extremism instead of tempering it, celebrated her violence instead of questioning it. She became what her environment made her, which is perhaps the most human way to become a monster. The Light's continued response to Sally's prayers throughout her years as High Inquisitor raises troubling theological questions that scholars have debated since the fall of Lordaeron. How could a benevolent divine power continue to empower someone who used that power to torture and murder innocents? Some argue that the Light is not sentient in the way mortals understand sentience, that it responds to faith and willpower regardless of moral intention. Others suggest that the Light hoped to eventually redeem Sally, keeping its connection to her open against the day when she might be ready to change. Whatever the answer, the fact remains that Sally Whitemane performed atrocities with holy fire, condemned innocents to death with sacred prayers, and tortured victims using the power that was supposed to heal them. The Light's neutrality in these matters is either a profound mystery or a profound indictment, depending on one's theological perspective. But her story also offers a note of hope, however faint. Even after everything she did, even after death itself, Sally Whitemane found a way forward. She cannot change the past, but she can be different in the present. The hatred that defined her life does not have to define her existence beyond life. The clarity that death brought to Sally raises its own questions. Why did resurrection, as a death knight, free her from the madness that had consumed her in life? Some have suggested that the process of dying and being raised strips away the psychological defenses that prevent mortals from facing their true selves. Others theorize that the particular nature of death, night resurrection, which involves a different kind of spiritual transformation than natural death, somehow reset Sally's emotional state to something closer to what she had been before her trauma. Whatever the explanation, the result is clear. Sally Whitemane was given a second chance that most never receive. She was allowed to see herself clearly, to recognize the monster she had become, and to choose a different path. Not everyone who commits atrocities receives such an opportunity. Most go to their graves, never understanding the harm they caused, never feeling the weight of their victims' suffering. Sally was forced to feel all of it, and she chose to keep living anyway. That choice, in itself, represents a kind of courage. It would have been easier to surrender to despair, to let the guilt destroy her as thoroughly as the trauma had once twisted her. Instead, Sally accepted the burden of her memories and determined to do better. She could not undo the past, but she could refuse to let the past determine her future. Sally Whitemane continues to serve among the Four Horsemen, fighting against threats to Azeroth and working alongside former enemies who have become her comrades. The Priestess of the Light is gone, replaced by a Death Knight who remembers what she once was. Whether she will ever find true peace, whether she will ever be able to forgive herself for what she did, remains to be seen. The relationships she has formed with her fellow horsemen provide some measure of comfort, even if none of them would describe what they have as friendship. They are bound together by shared purpose and shared nature, by the unique experience of existing as intelligent undead in a world that fears and hates them. They understand each other in ways that the living cannot, and that understanding creates a bond that transcends ordinary social categories. Renault Mograine, in particular, shares a complex history with Sally. His father, Alexandros, was one of the heroes she had admired in her youth, and his brother Renault was her companion and commander for years. The revelation of Renault's treachery must have added another layer to Sally's understanding of how corrupted the Scarlet Crusade had become. She had served alongside a patricide without ever suspecting the truth, had followed his orders and supported his authority while he carried the guilt of murdering the greatest champion the light had ever produced. For now, she fights. It is all she knows how to do, all she has ever known how to do. But perhaps in time, she will learn something else. Perhaps death has given her opportunities that life denied. That is the complete story of Sally Whitemane, from the innocent child in Southshore to the High Inquisitor of the Scarlet Crusade to the Death Knight of the Four Horsemen. Her tale spans the fall of Lordaeron and the rise of the Scourge, the corruption of the Crusade and its eventual collapse, the Legion's invasion, and the breaking of the helm of domination. She has been many things: victim and victimizer, healer and executioner, servant of the light and servant of death. Her story is not finished, may never be finished, as long as threats to Azeroth remain. But whatever comes next, Sally Whitemane will face it, as she has faced everything else in her existence. The tale of Sally Whitemane reminds us that heroes and villains are not born but made, shaped by the experiences that befall them and the choices they make in response. She was not destined for darkness, was not condemned by fate to become a monster. She became what circumstance and trauma made her, and she might have become something else that's entirely if her path had been different. But the same principle applies to her redemption. Sally Whitemane was not destined for clarity, was not guaranteed a second chance by any cosmic force. Death happened to give her what life had denied, but it could just as easily have ended her story forever. The opportunity for change came to her, and she chose to take it. That choice matters as much as all the choices that came before. In the end, Sally Whitemane's story is a human story, even if she is no longer human herself. It is a story about loss and grief, about rage and its consequences, about the possibility of transformation, even when transformation seems impossible. It is a story that asks us to consider what we might become if we faced what Sally faced, and whether we would do any better than she did. The answer, for most of us, is uncertain, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point, with fire in her heart and steel in her hands. If you enjoyed this exploration of Sally Whitemane's story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales from the world of Azeroth. The history of World of Warcraft is filled with tragic figures and compelling stories, and we look forward to sharing more of them with you. Sleep well, and may the light protect you